June 30th, 2025, polar bear devours three scientists at Arctic Research Station. The wind howled across the Beaufort Sea with a ferocity that seemed to come from the very heart of the Arctic itself, carrying with it the bitter scent of ice and salt, and something indefinably wild that made Dr. Leonard Marks pause in his morning coffee ritual and glance toward the reinforced windows of Research Station Omega 7. Outside, the landscape stretched endlessly in shades of white and grey, broken only by the dark water lids that snaked through the sea ice like frozen lightning. It was June 30th, 2025, and despite the calendar claiming summer, the temperature gauge mounted beside the station's main entrance read -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Leonard adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, a nervous habit he'd developed during his 37 years of life, 20 of which had been dedicated to Arctic marine biology. His reflection in the triple-pane window showed a man weathered by countless expeditions to the planet's most inhospitable places, premature lines around his pale blue eyes, sandy hair that had begun to thin at the crown, and the lean build of someone who spent more time thinking than eating. He wore the standard-issue red thermal underwear beneath his fleece-lined work pants, the uniform of the National Science Foundation's Arctic Research Division. "Storms picking up," he murmured to himself, watching as snow devils danced across the ice sheet that extended to the horizon. The research station sat on a concrete platform, elevated 12 feet above the permafrost, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that was currently buried under 3 feet of accumulated snow. Everything about their location, roughly 47 miles northeast of Point Barrow, Alaska, screamed isolation. Station Omega 7 had been operational for 8 years, serving as a forward observation post for climate change research and marine ecosystem monitoring. The facility consisted of 3 interconnected modules: the main laboratory and living quarters, the equipment storage and communication hub, and the power generation unit that housed the diesel generators and backup wind turbine. A 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire surrounded the entire compound, though Leonard had always wondered what good it would do against the Arctic's most formidable predator. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with its familiar rhythm. Leonard had been stationed at Omega 7 for 6 weeks now, part of a rotating research team studying the dramatic changes in sea ice formation patterns. The data they'd collected was troubling. Ice thickness measurements showed a 30% reduction compared to the same period in 2020, and the formation timeline had shifted by nearly 3 weeks. But it wasn't just the environmental implications that kept Leonard awake at night. It was what those changes meant for the wildlife that depended on the ice. Dr. Susan Lin emerged from the sleeping quarters, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, already dressed in her field gear despite the early hour. At 34, Susan was considered one of the leading experts in polar bear behavioral ecology, having spent the better part of a decade tracking and studying the great white bears across the Arctic Circle. Her research had taken her from Svalbard to Churchill, from Greenland to the remote islands of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone equally comfortable in a university lecture hall or on a wind-swept ice floe. "Morning, Leonard," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Vancouver upbringing. "Radio check came in about 20 minutes ago. Weather service is calling for winds up to 45 knots by this afternoon." Leonard nodded, pouring a second cup of coffee and handing it to her. "David's already up? Been up since 4, running diagnostics on the ice-penetrating radar. Kid doesn't sleep." Susan accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her gloved hands around the ceramic mug. Even inside the heated station, the cold seemed to seep through every surface. David Ortega was the team's electronics technician, a 28-year-old former Navy communications specialist who'd traded military service for scientific research. His technical expertise with the station's sophisticated monitoring equipment was matched only by his almost obsessive attention to detail. Leonard had worked with dozens of technicians over his career, but few possessed David's combination of skill and dedication. The main laboratory hummed with electronic activity. Computers processing real-time data from sensors embedded in the sea ice, satellite communication equipment maintaining their link to the outside world, and banks of monitoring devices tracking everything from water temperature to wind speed to seismic activity. Red LED displays showed current conditions: air temperature -12 Fahrenheit, wind from the northwest at 28 knots, barometric pressure falling steadily. David looked up from a control panel as they entered, his dark eyes bright with concentration. "Morning, Docs. We've got some interesting readings from the Northern Sensor Array." He was compact and muscular, built like the wrestler he'd been in high school, with close-cropped black hair and the steady hands essential for precision electronics work. "What kind of readings?" Susan asked, settling onto a stool beside the main monitoring station. "Seismic activity about 2 miles northeast of here. Not major, barely registering on the Richter scale, but consistent. Started around midnight, and it's been building gradually." David pulled up a seismograph display showing a series of small but regular spikes. Could be ice movement, thermal fracturing, but the pattern's unusual. Leonard studied the data, his brow furrowing. Seismic activity in the Arctic wasn't uncommon. The constant freeze-thaw cycle, combined with tidal forces and thermal expansion, created a symphony of cracks, groans, and subtle shifts in the ice. But David was right. This pattern was different. The intervals were too regular, too rhythmic. "Any correlation with the tide tables?" Leonard asked. "That's what I thought initially, but no. High tide was at 0347 hours. Low tides not until 10:22. This started well before the tidal cycle." David adjusted several controls, isolating the seismic data from background noise. "It's almost like something large is moving across the ice in a regular pattern." Susan set down her coffee, suddenly alert. In her years of polar bear research, she'd learned to pay attention to patterns that others might dismiss. Polar bears were creatures of habit, following established travel routes across the sea ice, returning to productive hunting areas with predictable regularity. A large male could weigh over 1,000 pounds, certainly enough to create detectable seismic signatures as it moved across the ice. "Distance and bearing from our position?" she asked. David consulted his instruments. "Best estimate puts it about 2.3 miles northeast, moving in a rough line parallel to our position. Whatever it is, it's been moving consistently for the past 6 hours." The implication hung in the air, unspoken. Polar bears were known to travel enormous distances across the sea ice, sometimes covering 30 or 40 miles in a single day. They were also intensely curious creatures, drawn to investigate anything unusual in their territory. A research station with its unfamiliar smells, sounds, and electromagnetic signatures would be exactly the kind of anomaly that might attract their attention. "We should increase our observation schedule," Susan said finally. "Leonard, can you handle the 0800 ice thickness measurements while David and I set up the motion sensors around the perimeter?" Leonard nodded. The daily routine of scientific observation provided structure to their isolated existence, but it also meant regular exposure to the harsh Arctic environment. Each team member was required to perform external observations at least twice daily, taking measurements, checking equipment, and maintaining their physical connection to the environment they were studying. The morning observation routine began with Leonard suiting up in his extreme weather gear, a process that had become automatic after 6 weeks, but still required 15 minutes of careful preparation. Base layer of merino wool thermal underwear, insulating layer of down-filled jacket and pants, outer shell of wind and waterproof Arctic gear, followed by insulated boots rated to -40 degrees, thick gloves with liner gloves underneath, balaclava, and finally the fur-trimmed hood that could seal completely against blowing snow. The station's main exit led to a small anteroom where the external equipment was stored: sample containers, measuring devices, emergency supplies, and the high-powered rifle that regulations required to be present whenever personnel worked outside the station. Leonard checked the rifle automatically, ensuring it was loaded with the heavy grain ammunition designed to stop a charging polar bear. In his years of Arctic research, he'd never had to fire a weapon at a polar bear, but the stories from other researchers were sobering enough to make him take the precautions seriously. The door seal broke with a soft hiss as pressurized air escaped, and Leonard stepped into the Arctic morning. The cold hit him like a physical blow, even through his insulated clothing. His breath formed instant clouds of vapor that crystallized and fell to the snow-covered platform. The wind carried a strange quality that morning, not just the usual howl of air moving across ice, but something that seemed to speak of vast distances and primal forces. Leonard made his way carefully down the metal stairs to the ice-level platform where the measurement equipment was located. The sea ice stretched away in all directions, a seemingly endless expanse of white, broken by pressure ridges where massive ice sheets had collided and buckled upward. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, he could see the dark line of open water, a lead that had opened during the night as the ice shifted with wind and current. The ice thickness gauge showed readings that continued the troubling trend they'd been documenting, an average thickness of only 43 inches compared to the 67 inches recorded at the same location the previous year. Leonard recorded the measurements methodically, but his attention was drawn to something else: tracks in the fresh snow around the measurement station. At first glance, they looked like dog prints, large round paw marks with claw impressions extending beyond the toe pads. But Leonard had seen enough polar bear tracks to recognize the distinctive characteristics: the enormous size, nearly 12 inches from heel to claw tip, the 5-toed pattern with the distinctive shape of the rear pad, and most tellingly, the spacing between prints that indicated the rolling gait of a mature polar bear. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the last few hours, judging by the sharp definition of the edges and the lack of wind erosion. They approached the measurement station from the northeast, the same direction as the seismic activity David had detected, circled the equipment once, and then continued toward the station itself before veering away toward the southwest. Leonard felt his pulse quicken as he followed the track pattern with his eyes. The bear had approached to within perhaps 200 yards of the station perimeter, close enough to observe their activities, to scent mark its territory, to assess whether these human intruders represented a threat or an opportunity. "Susan," he called into his radio, "you need to see this." Within minutes, Susan had joined him outside, David following with a camera and measuring equipment. Susan studied the tracks with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years interpreting polar bear sign. She knelt beside one particularly clear print, pulling out a measuring tape. "Male," she said definitively. "Large male. This pad measurement suggests a bear in the 1,200 to 1,400 pound range." She photographed the track from multiple angles, then began following the trail. "Look at the gait pattern. He's not hunting, not stressed. This is investigative behavior." David documented everything with methodical precision, taking GPS coordinates for each significant track, measuring stride length and pad size, photographing the approach route and departure path. "The tracks match up with our seismic data," he said. "Time frame, direction of travel, everything correlates." Susan stood up, brushing snow from her knees as she surveyed the surrounding ice. "He's been watching us," she said quietly. "Probably for hours, maybe days." The implications were sobering. Polar bears were apex predators with no natural fear of humans. A bear that had spent time observing their routines would know their patterns of movement, their vulnerabilities, the times when they were most exposed. Unlike brown bears or black bears, which generally avoided human contact, polar bears were known to actively hunt humans when the opportunity presented itself. "We need to implement enhanced security protocols immediately," Susan continued. "No more solo observations, everyone armed when outside, and we need to activate the perimeter alarm system." The perimeter alarm system consisted of motion sensors and tripwires installed around the station's fence line, designed to detect large animals approaching the compound. It had been installed 3 years earlier after a research team at a similar station had been trapped in their facility for 6 days by a polar bear that had decided to take up residence outside their door. They spent the next 2 hours activating and testing the security systems, checking the integrity of the perimeter fence, and establishing new protocols for all external activities. Leonard found himself glancing frequently toward the northeast, toward the endless expanse of ice where their visitor had appeared. Somewhere out there, a massive predator was going about its daily routine, but now that routine included awareness of their presence. The radio crackled to life as they finished their security preparations. "Omega-7, this is Barrow Base. Radio check and weather update, over." David keyed the microphone. "Barrow Base, this is Omega-7, reading you 5 by 5. All systems operational, personnel status green." "Copy, Omega-7. Weather Service has upgraded storm warning, winds to 60 knots expected by 1800 hours, with blowing snow and visibility dropping to near zero. Duration estimated at 12 to 18 hours. Recommend securing all external equipment and preparing for potential communication blackout." Leonard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. Weather in the Arctic could change with terrifying speed, transforming a manageable situation into a life-threatening emergency within hours. A communication blackout would leave them completely isolated, dependent entirely on their own resources and decision-making. "Copy weather warning, Barrow Base. We'll implement storm protocols immediately. Omega-7 out." Storm protocols meant securing everything that could be blown away or damaged by high winds, switching to emergency power mode to conserve fuel, and preparing the station to ride out potentially several days of severe weather. But more immediately, it meant their polar bear visitor would be seeking shelter from the storm, and their heated, sheltered research station might look very attractive. Susan was thinking along the same lines. "Storm weather changes polar bear behavior," she said, as they headed back inside. "They'll seek wind protection, conserve energy. A bear that's already shown interest in our station is going to be looking for shelter options." The afternoon was spent in frenetic preparation. External equipment was secured or brought inside, emergency supplies were moved to the main living area, backup communication systems were tested, and extra fuel was transferred to the main generators. Through it all, Leonard found himself acutely aware of the vulnerability of their position. 3 humans in a small outpost, surrounded by hundreds of miles of empty ice, with a storm approaching, and a polar bear somewhere in the vicinity. David monitored the seismic sensors continuously, reporting periodic activity that suggested their visitor was still in the area. The readings showed movement patterns consistent with a large animal foraging along the ice edge, occasionally approaching closer to the station before moving away again. "He's ranging back and forth," David reported during the afternoon briefing. "Roughly a 3-mile patrol route with our station at the southern end. Classic territorial behavior." Susan nodded grimly. "He's treating this as his territory now. We're the intruders as far as he's concerned." By late afternoon, the wind had increased dramatically, rattling the station's reinforced walls and creating a constant howl that made conversation difficult even inside the insulated facility. Snow began falling horizontally, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Leonard watched through the main observation window as their familiar Arctic landscape disappeared into a wall of white. The evening meal was a subdued affair. They went through the motions of their usual routine: heated rations, hot coffee, brief discussion of the next day's research schedule. But everyone's attention was focused on the storm raging outside, and the knowledge that somewhere in that storm a massive predator was riding out the weather. "Radio schedule's going to be important," David said as they cleaned up after dinner. "Barrow Base expects check-ins every 6 hours during storm conditions. If we miss 2 consecutive contacts, they'll start thinking about a rescue operation." Leonard glanced at his watch. 18:47 hours. The next mandatory radio contact was at midnight. 6 hours to monitor their security systems, track the storm's progress, and hope that their uninvited neighbor had found somewhere else to shelter. The perimeter alarm system remained quiet through the early evening hours, its sensors detecting nothing larger than wind-blown debris. David maintained continuous monitoring of both the communication equipment and the seismic sensors, looking for any indication that their visitor was moving closer. At 21:30 hours, the power flickered. It was just for a moment. The lights dimmed, the electronic equipment reset itself, and then everything returned to normal. But in the Arctic, power failures could be fatal. The station's heating system, communication equipment, and life support all depended on electrical power generated by the diesel engines in the power module. "Fuel line icing," David diagnosed, checking the power generation displays. "The extreme cold is causing condensation in the fuel lines. I need to go out and check the generators." Susan immediately shook her head. "Not alone, not in these conditions." Leonard looked out at the storm, where visibility was essentially zero, and the wind was strong enough to knock a person off their feet. But David was right. If they lost power in these temperatures, they would have perhaps 2 hours before the station became uninhabitably cold. "We go together," Leonard decided. "Full storm gear, safety lines, rifles, and we stay in constant radio contact." The process of preparing for external operations in storm conditions was elaborate and dangerous. Each person wore full Arctic survival gear, including emergency shelters, signaling devices, and enough food and water to survive 24 hours if separated from the station. Safety lines were attached to anchor points inside the station and would be maintained throughout any external work. The power module was connected to the main station by an enclosed walkway, but the 100-foot journey in these conditions would be hazardous. Leonard checked his watch. 21:47 hours. They had roughly 4 hours before the midnight radio check. The anteroom door opened into a howling maelstrom of wind and snow. Visibility was limited to perhaps 10 feet, and the wind was strong enough that they had to lean into it to maintain their footing. The safety line stretched away into the white darkness, their only connection to safety. The journey to the power module took nearly 20 minutes of careful movement along the safety line, with frequent stops to check their position and maintain contact with each other. The sound of the diesel generators grew louder as they approached, a steady rumble that suggested they were still operating normally despite the power fluctuations. Inside the power module, David immediately began checking fuel lines, electrical connections, and generator status displays. Leonard and Susan maintained watch at the windows, though there was nothing to see beyond swirling snow illuminated by the module's external lights. "Found it," David called over the generator noise. "Ice crystal buildup in the fuel filter assembly. Give me about 15 minutes to clear it and install the heated filter elements." Leonard checked his watch again. 2203 hours. They were making good time, and the generator repair seemed straightforward. He relaxed slightly, allowing himself to believe that they would complete the maintenance and return to the main station without incident. The perimeter alarm activated at 22:07 hours. The sound was barely audible over the storm noise, a steady electronic tone transmitted through their radio headsets. But its meaning was unmistakable. Something large had crossed the sensor perimeter and was approaching the station. "David, how much longer?" Susan asked urgently. 10 minutes, maybe less. I can't rush this or we'll lose power completely." Leonard moved to the module's main window, straining to see through the storm. The external lights created a cone of visibility extending perhaps 15 feet from the building, beyond which everything disappeared into white chaos. If something was out there, it could approach to within a few yards before becoming visible. The motion sensor alarm continued its steady warning tone. Whatever had triggered it was maintaining its position within the detection zone, not simply passing through as a wind-blown object would. Something was out there, sheltering perhaps in the lee of the station buildings, riding out the storm while maintaining proximity to the human inhabitants. "Contact Barrow Base," David said, still working on the generator. "We need to report the perimeter intrusion." Leonard keyed his radio. "Barrow Base, this is Omega 7. We have a perimeter alarm activation during generator maintenance operations. Requesting guidance. Over." Static filled the radio channel. The storm was intensifying, interfering with their communication systems. Leonard tried again, adjusting frequencies and power levels, but received only fragmented transmissions in response. "Communications degraded," he reported. "We're essentially on our own until the storm passes." Susan had moved to the opposite window, scanning the limited visible area for any sign of movement. The polar bear tracks they'd found that morning proved their visitor was still in the area, and storm conditions would drive any sensible animal to seek shelter. The station complex, with its heated buildings and wind protection, would be an attractive location. "Motion sensor shows contact approximately 50 meters northeast of the main station," Susan reported, reading from her handheld receiver. "That puts it between us and the main facility." The implications were immediate and terrifying. Their return route to the main station would take them directly through the area where the motion sensor had detected the intruder. In storm conditions with limited visibility, they could walk directly into a polar bear without warning. David completed the generator maintenance at 22:21 hours, installing the heated filter elements and testing the system under load. Power stabilized immediately, ensuring that the station would continue operating throughout the storm. But their successful repair was overshadowed by the growing certainty that they were no longer alone in the storm. "We need to get back to the main station," Leonard said. "Full precautions, weapons ready, stay together." The return journey began as a careful movement along the safety line, with each person maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings despite the limited visibility. The storm seemed to have intensified further, with wind gusts that threatened to tear them from the safety line and snow that struck with the force of small projectiles. They had covered perhaps 30 feet when Susan stopped abruptly. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Leonard paused, trying to detect anything beyond the clean scent of snow and the mechanical odors from the power module. But there was something else, a wild, musky odor that seemed familiar but out of place in the sterile Arctic environment. "Polar bear," Susan said quietly. "Fresh scent. Very close." The safety line stretched ahead into the white darkness, their only guide back to the safety of the main station. But somewhere in that darkness, a massive predator was moving through the storm, following its own instincts and patterns that had evolved over thousands of years of Arctic survival. Leonard checked his rifle, ensuring that a round was chambered and the safety was off. Beside him, Susan and David made similar preparations. In weather like this, with visibility measured in feet rather than yards, their first warning of a polar bear's presence might be the moment it attacked. They resumed movement along the safety line, each step carefully placed, constantly scanning the limited visible area for any sign of the white-on-white camouflage that made polar bears nearly invisible in these conditions. The motion sensor continued its steady alarm tone, indicating that whatever had triggered it was still within the detection perimeter. At 22:34 hours, 40 feet from the main station, they found the first sign of their visitor. Tracks in the fresh snow, already beginning to fill but still clearly visible, showed where a large animal had moved from the northeast toward the station complex. The prints were enormous, even larger than the ones they'd found that morning, and showed the characteristic claw marks and pad shape of a polar bear. But these tracks were different. While the morning tracks had shown a bear investigating the station from a distance, these approached directly toward the main facility, following the safety line they were now using for their return journey. "He's learned our routine," Susan said quietly. "He knows we use this path." The tracks continued parallel to the safety line for another 20 feet before veering away toward the main station building. At the point where they diverged, the snow was disturbed in a pattern that suggested the bear had paused, possibly to observe or scent mark the area. Leonard felt a chill of recognition. In all his years of wildlife research, he'd learned that the most dangerous animals were those that had lost their fear of humans and begun to see them as potential prey. A polar bear that was actively studying human behavior patterns was exhibiting exactly that kind of adaptation. They reached the main station at 22:42 hours, quickly securing the external door and conducting a full perimeter check of the facility. The motion sensors continued to show intermittent contacts around the station, suggesting that their visitor was moving around the buildings, investigating from multiple angles. Inside the main station, they established a watch schedule that would ensure continuous monitoring of the perimeter sensors throughout the night. The midnight radio check revealed continued communication difficulties, with only fragmentary contact possible with Barrow Base. Storm duration, estimated 12 to 18 hours, was the only clear transmission they received. Maintain emergency protocols until conditions improve. Leonard settled into the first watch at 0100 hours, monitoring the perimeter sensors, while Susan and David caught what rest they could. The storm continued to rage outside, creating a constant background of wind noise and rattling walls. But occasionally, beneath the storm sounds, he thought he could hear something else, a shuffling, scratching sound that might have been wind-blown debris, or might have been something much more concerning. The motion sensors showed periodic activations throughout the early morning hours, indicating movement around the station perimeter. The pattern was consistent with a large animal conducting a systematic investigation of the facility, testing the integrity of the barriers, looking for potential entry points or vulnerabilities. At 0347 hours, during David's watch, the exterior lights detected movement. David was monitoring the sensor displays when motion-activated floodlights illuminated the area immediately adjacent to the main station. Through the storm, barely visible in the swirling snow, a massive white shape moved along the fence line. The polar bear was enormous, easily the largest David had ever seen, even in photographs. Its shoulders stood higher than the bottom rail of the fence, and its massive head swung back and forth as it investigated the barrier. Even through the storm and the protective glass, David could see the intelligent calculation in the bear's dark eyes as it assessed the human facility. The bear moved with the fluid grace of a perfectly adapted predator, its broad paws distributing its weight across the snow with no apparent effort. It paused at the main gate, rising on its hind legs to test the height of the fence, then dropped back to all fours and continued its circuit of the perimeter. David activated the recording equipment, capturing as much detail as possible despite the poor visibility. This was behavior that Susan would want to analyze. A polar bear conducting what appeared to be a systematic reconnaissance of a human facility. The bear completed its circuit of the fence line and paused near the main building, directly beneath the window where David was observing. For a moment, predator and human regarded each other through the reinforced glass, separated by perhaps 8 feet of distance and several inches of barrier material. Then, the bear did something that sent a chill through David's body. It reared up on its hind legs, placed its front paws against the building wall, and began testing the structural integrity of the exterior panels. The scratching sound Leonard had heard earlier became clearly audible, the sound of claws designed to dig through sea ice being applied to the metal siding of their shelter. The bear worked methodically, testing different areas, applying pressure to potential weak points, learning the construction details of the building that housed its potential prey. David activated the emergency alarm, waking Leonard and Susan instantly. Within seconds, they were at the observation windows, watching as the massive predator continued its investigation of their shelter. "He's problem-solving," Susan said quietly, her voice filled with professional fascination despite the danger. "Look at the systematic approach. He's mapping our defenses." The bear spent nearly 30 minutes investigating the main building, testing walls, windows, and the main door. It showed particular interest in the ventilation system, following the external ductwork with its nose, clearly detecting the warm air and human scents flowing from the building's interior. At 0420 hours, the bear moved away from the main building and began investigating the enclosed walkway that connected to the power module. David watched through the security cameras as the massive animal followed the walkway's entire length, testing the structural connections, investigating the access doors. "He's learning the layout of our entire facility," Leonard observed. "Next time he approaches, he'll know exactly where our vulnerabilities are." The bear completed its investigation and moved away from the immediate station area, but the motion sensors continued to show intermittent contacts throughout the early morning hours. Their visitor had established the station as part of its territory and was maintaining surveillance from various positions around the perimeter. Dawn arrived as a gradual lightening of the storm rather than actual sunrise, the Arctic summer providing nearly 24 hours of daylight, though the current conditions made it difficult to distinguish day from night. The storm showed signs of weakening, with wind speeds dropping and visibility improving slightly. At 0630 hours, Leonard attempted the morning radio check with Barrow Base. Communication was still difficult, but he managed to transmit a brief status report, including the polar bear encounter. "Copy, Omega-7, came the scratchy reply. "Storm clearing expected by 1200 hours. Maintain security protocols until conditions allow helicopter reconnaissance." Helicopter reconnaissance meant that within hours, weather permitting, a search and rescue aircraft would overfly their position to assess their situation. But it also meant enduring several more hours of isolation with their dangerous neighbor maintaining his vigil. Susan spent the morning analyzing the recorded footage of the bear's behavior, documenting the systematic investigation techniques and calculating the animal's approximate size and weight. Her preliminary assessment was sobering. They were dealing with a mature male polar bear in the 1,400 to 1,600 pound range, displaying intelligent problem-solving behavior and showing no fear of human activity. "This is predatory investigation," she concluded. "He's not just curious about us. He's assessing us as potential prey." David maintained continuous monitoring of the perimeter sensors while conducting routine maintenance on their communication and power systems. The generator repair from the previous night had resolved the power fluctuation issues, but the extended storm had stressed all of their systems. Leonard coordinated their defensive preparations, checking weapons, ammunition, and emergency supplies. The station's emergency protocol manual included procedures for polar bear encounters, but those procedures assumed the bear would eventually move on rather than establishing a permanent surveillance position. The morning passed slowly, with periodic motion sensor activations indicating that their visitor was maintaining his patrol pattern around the station. The storm continued to weaken, and by 10:30 hours, visibility had improved enough to see roughly 100 yards from the station. It was then that they discovered they were not dealing with a single bear. Susan was conducting a visual surveillance sweep when she spotted movement approximately 200 yards northeast of the station. Through binoculars, she could clearly see a second polar bear, smaller than their previous visitor but still substantial, probably a female in the 800 to 1,000 pound range. "We have a mated pair," she announced grimly. "This changes everything." Polar bear mating behavior was complex and potentially dangerous to humans. A male and female traveling together would be highly territorial and extremely protective of their shared range. They would also be more unpredictable, with reproductive instincts adding another layer of complexity to their behavioral patterns. David's seismic monitoring confirmed the presence of multiple large animals in the vicinity of the station. The sensor readings showed distinct signatures from at least 2 different sources, moving independently but maintaining coordination with each other. "They're hunting together," Susan continued her analysis. "The male's been doing reconnaissance while the female maintained a support position. Classic pack behavior." Leonard felt their situation shifting from concerning to genuinely dangerous. 2 polar bears working in coordination presented a threat that their defensive preparations might not be adequate to handle. A single bear could potentially be deterred by noise, barriers, or if necessary, gunfire, but a coordinated attack by 2 bears would overwhelm their defenses quickly. The improved visibility allowed them to observe both animals more clearly as the morning progressed. The male continued his systematic patrol of the station perimeter, while the female remained in a position that would allow her to intercept anyone attempting to leave the facility. They were effectively surrounded. At 11:47 hours, 13 minutes before the scheduled helicopter reconnaissance, their situation deteriorated catastrophically. David was monitoring the communication equipment when he detected an irregular power fluctuation in the main electrical system. The problem wasn't with the generators; those were running smoothly after the previous night's repairs, but with the main distribution panel inside the station. Investigation revealed that moisture had infiltrated the electrical panel, causing corrosion in several key circuit breakers. The heating system was operating at reduced capacity, the communication equipment was functioning intermittently, and most critically, the perimeter alarm system had become unreliable. "I can fix it," David assured them, "but I need about 2 hours with the main power switched off. We'll be running on battery backup only." Battery backup would provide minimal lighting and emergency communication capability, but no heating. In the current conditions, with exterior temperatures at -15 degrees, the station would become dangerously cold within an hour of losing main power. Leonard checked his watch. 11:50 hours. The helicopter reconnaissance was scheduled to overfly their position at 1200 hours. If they could make contact with the aircraft, they might be able to request immediate evacuation before undertaking the electrical repairs. At exactly 1200 hours, they heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the diminishing storm noise. Leonard immediately activated the emergency radio beacon and attempted to establish contact with the aircraft. "Rescue 1, this is Omega 7. Do you copy?" "Omega 7, this is Rescue 1. We have your beacon. Conducting visual reconnaissance of your position. Report your status." Leonard provided a concise summary of their situation. Operational station with minor electrical issues, 2 polar bears in immediate vicinity, all personnel healthy and accounted for. He requested guidance on whether immediate evacuation was recommended. Negative on immediate evacuation, Omega-7. Weather conditions still marginal for landing operations. We'll maintain overwatch for 30 minutes and reassess. Advise if situation deteriorates. The helicopter's presence had an immediate effect on the polar bears. Both animals moved to positions with overhead cover, demonstrating their familiarity with aircraft and their potential threat. But rather than leaving the area, they simply repositioned themselves to maintain surveillance of the station while avoiding the helicopter. Rescue 1. Be advised that polar bear behavior indicates they are not departing the area despite aircraft presence. Animals appear to be establishing territorial claim on this location. Copy that, Omega-7. We're documenting from altitude for wildlife management evaluation. Continue normal operations and report any changes. The helicopter's 30-minute overwatch period passed without significant incident, though the polar bears maintained their positions around the station throughout the aircraft's presence. When Rescue 1 departed at 12:30 hours, both bears immediately resumed their active patrol patterns. Leonard made the decision to proceed with the electrical repairs despite the risk. The alternative, operating with degraded systems indefinitely, posed an even greater long-term danger. They established a rotation schedule that would allow David to work on the electrical system while Leonard and Susan maintained armed watch at the perimeter windows. At 13:15 hours, David switched the main power to battery backup and began working on the electrical panel. The station's interior temperature immediately began dropping and the perimeter alarm system went completely offline. They were now dependent entirely on visual observation for early warning of polar bear approach. The electrical repair work proceeded methodically, with David replacing corroded components and sealing moisture entry points. But the work required complete concentration, leaving Leonard and Susan to monitor both bears while managing the steadily dropping interior temperature. At 13:42 hours, Susan lost visual contact with the female bear. She had been tracking both animals through the observation windows when the female simply disappeared from view. The male continued his patrol pattern, but the female had vanished into the broken ice terrain northeast of the station. "David, how much longer on those repairs?" Susan asked urgently. "At least another hour. I can't rush this without risking permanent damage to the system." Leonard joined Susan at the observation windows, scanning the visible area for any sign of the missing female. Polar bears were capable of extraordinary stealth when hunting, using their white coloration and patient stalking techniques to approach prey undetected. The male bear had also altered his behavior, moving closer to the station perimeter and showing increased agitation. He was pacing back and forth along the fence line, occasionally rising on his hind legs to test the barrier height, clearly aware that something had changed in the situation. At 13:56 hours, they heard scratching sounds from the roof. The sounds were faint but unmistakable, claws moving across metal roofing material, followed by the creaking of structural supports under significant weight. The female bear had somehow accessed the station roof and was investigating from above. Leonard grabbed his rifle and moved to the center of the main room, looking up at the ceiling panels that separated them from the bear above. The scratching sounds moved systematically across the roof, pausing at areas where structural supports provided the strongest attachment points. "She's testing the roof integrity," Susan observed, her voice tight with controlled fear, looking for weak spots. The ceiling panels were designed to support snow loading and wind stress, but they were not intended to resist a determined polar bear attempting to gain entry. The scratching sounds continued for several minutes, moving from the main laboratory area toward the living quarters. David continued working on the electrical repairs with desperate intensity, knowing that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without power to the heating system and perimeter alarms, they were becoming increasingly vulnerable with each passing minute. At 14:03 hours, the roof sound stopped. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the scratching had been. Leonard maintained his position in the center of the room, rifle ready, while Susan continued monitoring the area visible through the windows. The male bear had also stopped his pacing and was standing motionless beside the perimeter fence, looking directly at the main building. "She's moved to a new position," Susan said quietly. "But where?" The answer came at 14:07 hours, when motion sensors in the power module activated. The female bear had somehow accessed the enclosed walkway connecting the power module to the main station. David's equipment registered vibrations consistent with a large animal moving through the connecting passage, testing doors and structural joints. "David, we need power now," Leonard said urgently. 10 more minutes. I'm working as fast as I can." 10 minutes might be more time than they had. If the female bear gained access to the power module, she could damage the generators and leave them without heat or communication in sub-zero temperatures. Worse, the power module's construction was less robust than the main station, providing a potential entry point into their shelter. Leonard made a tactical decision. "Susan, maintain watch on the male. I'm going to the power module to secure the generators." "Not alone," Susan immediately objected. "We stick together. Someone needs to watch David's back while he finishes the repairs. The female's in the power module now. She's the immediate threat." Leonard gathered emergency equipment, rifle, ammunition, portable radio, emergency shelter kit. The journey to the power module would require going outside into the storm, crossing the 100 feet of open ground between buildings, while a male polar bear maintained surveillance of the area. At 14:12 hours, Leonard opened the external door and stepped into the Arctic afternoon. The storm had continued to weaken, but visibility was still limited to perhaps 50 yards. More importantly, the male polar bear was nowhere to be seen from the main station door. Leonard paused in the doorway, scanning the visible area, trying to locate the massive predator that had been pacing the fence line just minutes earlier. The safety line stretched across the open ground toward the power module, still partially buried by wind-blown snow, but providing a guide through the limited visibility conditions. Leonard began moving along the line, constantly scanning for any sign of movement in the white landscape around him. He had covered perhaps 30 feet when he found the male bear's tracks in the fresh snow. The prints were enormous and clearly fresh, leading from the fence line directly toward the path Leonard was following. The bear had intercepted his route and was somewhere ahead between Leonard and the power module. Leonard keyed his radio. "Susan, the male's not at the fence. His tracks show he's moved to intercept my route to the power module." "Leonard, abort and return immediately. We'll find another solution." But Leonard was already committed to the crossing, and returning to the main station would require covering the same dangerous ground. He continued toward the power module, rifle ready, moving slowly and carefully along the safety line. The enclosed walkway came into view through the blowing snow, and Leonard could immediately see that something was wrong. The access door that should have been closed and latched was standing partially open, moving slightly in the wind. Fresh scratches around the doorframe showed where powerful claws had worked to manipulate the latch mechanism. Inside the power module, Leonard could hear the steady rumble of the diesel generators, but also something else, a rhythmic scratching sound that indicated the female bear was still inside, investigating the equipment. Leonard approached the walkway entrance cautiously, knowing that he was about to enter a confined space with a polar bear that outweighed him by nearly 1,000 pounds. But the generators were critical to their survival, and allowing a bear to damage them would be fatal for all three researchers. The walkway stretched 20 feet between the main station and the power module, an enclosed corridor with access doors at each end. Leonard opened the station side door carefully, listening for any sound that would indicate the bear's exact location. The scratching sounds were coming from the far end of the walkway, inside the power module itself. Leonard moved through the corridor slowly, his rifle ready, approaching the power module door that the bear had forced open. At the power module entrance, Leonard could see into the generator room. The female polar bear was investigating the fuel storage tanks, her massive bulk filling the narrow space between equipment racks. She had not yet noticed his presence, giving him a brief, tactical advantage. Leonard had two options: retreat and allow the bear to potentially damage critical equipment, or attempt to drive the bear from the power module using noise and intimidation. In the confined space, using the rifle would be extremely dangerous. Even a successful shot could result in equipment damage that would cripple their power systems. He chose a middle course, firing a warning shot into the air outside the power module, while shouting loudly to startle the bear into retreat. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The female bear spun toward the sound, her dark eyes fixing on Leonard with unmistakable predatory intent. Instead of retreating, she began moving toward him through the narrow space between generators. Leonard backed quickly into the walkway, but the confined space limited his options. The bear was following, her massive shoulders brushing against equipment as she pursued him through the generator room. In the narrow walkway, Leonard would have no room to maneuver if the bear charged. He keyed his radio desperately. "Susan, I need immediate assistance at the power module. The female's pursuing me through the walkway." Susan's response was immediate. "Leonard, get out of there now. I'm activating the emergency alarm system." But the walkway offered no alternative routes, and the bear was now emerging from the power module into the connecting corridor. Leonard found himself trapped between a polar bear behind him and 20 feet of narrow corridor ahead, with no room to use his rifle effectively. At that moment, David's electrical repairs reached completion. Power surged back into the station's systems, immediately reactivating the heating system, communication equipment, and most importantly, the perimeter alarm system. The sudden return of electrical activity seemed to startle the pursuing bear, causing her to pause momentarily in the walkway. Leonard used the brief hesitation to reach the station side door, pulling it closed behind him and activating the emergency locking mechanism. The door was reinforced and designed to withstand storm conditions, but Leonard had no illusions about its ability to stop a determined polar bear. Inside the main station, Susan and David were monitoring the situation through security cameras that had come back online with the restored power. The cameras showed the female bear in the walkway testing the locked door, while exterior cameras revealed that the male had moved to a position directly outside the main station entrance. "We're trapped," Susan said grimly. "Male outside the main door, female in the walkway. They've coordinated to cut off our escape routes." David was running diagnostics on all systems, confirming that the power restoration had been successful and all equipment was functioning normally. But their improved technical situation was overshadowed by the tactical reality of being surrounded by two polar bears working in apparent coordination. At 14:34 hours, the situation escalated further. The female bear in the walkway had given up testing the locked door and was now applying significant force to the barrier. The reinforced door was holding, but the sound of claws on metal and the vibration of impact suggested that the barrier would not hold indefinitely. Simultaneously, the male bear outside the main station had begun similar testing of the main entrance, rising on his hind legs to apply pressure to the door frame, while working at the latch mechanism with remarkable dexterity. Leonard established defensive positions inside the main station, with Susan covering the walkway door while he monitored the main entrance. David maintained communication with Barrow Base, requesting immediate emergency evacuation. "Barrow Base, this is Omega-7 with a code red emergency. We have two polar bears attempting to breach our facility, requesting immediate helicopter evacuation. Omega-7, Rescue 1 is en route to your position. ETA 25 minutes. Maintain defensive positions until aircraft arrives." 25 minutes seemed like an eternity, with polar bears actively working to gain entry to their shelter. The bears showed no sign of being deterred by the locked doors, and their systematic approach to breaching the barriers suggested intelligence and determination that was deeply concerning. At 14:41 hours, the walkway door began to fail. The female bear had focused her efforts on the door frame rather than the door itself, using her claws to work at the metal attachment points where the frame connected to the walkway structure. The sound of tearing metal became audible as the barrier began to separate from its mounting. Susan aimed her rifle at the failing door, knowing that she would have only 1 or 2 shots before the bear would be inside the main station. In the confined space, missing would likely be fatal for all 3 researchers. Leonard was dealing with a similar situation at the main entrance, where the male bear had begun systematic destruction of the door frame. The main door was more robust than the walkway barrier, but the bear's size and strength were proving adequate to overcome human engineering. David activated every emergency signaling device available, radio beacons, flares, emergency transmitters, hoping to attract the attention of the approaching rescue helicopter or any other aircraft in the area. At 14:47 hours, 12 minutes before the estimated arrival of Rescue 1, the walkway door failed completely. The door frame separated from its mounting with a sharp crack of failing metal, and the female polar bear immediately began pushing through the opening. Susan fired once, aiming for the bear's center mass, but the confined space and her position made accurate shooting difficult. The shot struck the bear in the shoulder, causing her to roar in pain and anger, but not stopping her advance. If anything, the wound seemed to increase her determination to reach the humans who had caused her injury. Susan worked the bolt of her rifle, chambering a second round while backing toward the center of the main room. The wounded bear was now fully inside the station, her massive bulk filling the space between equipment racks, dark eyes fixed on the humans with unmistakable predatory intent. Leonard faced his own crisis as the main door frame began its final failure. The male bear had worked methodically at the mounting points, and the barrier was now hanging by only a few attachment bolts. Within moments, both bears would be inside the station. At 14:49 hours, Leonard made a desperate decision. Instead of waiting for the door to fail completely, he opened it himself and stepped outside, hoping to draw the male bear away from the main station, where Susan was dealing with the wounded female. The male bear was immediately in front of him, rising to its full height of over 8 feet as Leonard emerged from the station. At close range, the bear was even more massive than Leonard had imagined. A perfectly adapted killing machine with no natural predators and no innate fear of humans. Leonard fired twice in quick succession, both shots striking the bear center mass. The heavy grain ammunition was designed specifically for stopping dangerous game, and both rounds had immediate effect. The bear staggered, blood appearing on his white fur, but remained standing and focused on Leonard. Inside the station, Susan was engaged in her own life-or-death struggle. The wounded female had advanced to within 6 feet of her position and was showing no signs of being deterred by the gunshot wound. Susan's second shot struck the bear in the chest, but the animal's incredible vitality kept her moving forward. Leonard's third shot dropped the male bear to its knees, but the massive animal continued trying to reach him, crawling forward across the snow-covered platform. Leonard backed toward the station perimeter, maintaining distance while reloading his rifle. Susan's third shot finally stopped the female bear, the animal collapsing between the equipment racks just 8 feet from where Susan stood. The sudden silence after the gunshots was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. At 14:52 hours, 7 minutes ahead of schedule, Rescue 1 appeared through the diminishing storm. The helicopter crew immediately assessed the situation. 2 wounded polar bears, 1 dead female inside the station, 1 critically wounded male on the platform, and 3 researchers who had successfully defended their position but were clearly in need of immediate evacuation. Omega-7, this is Rescue 1. We see the situation. Preparing for emergency extraction. Move to the designated landing zone immediately. Leonard helped Susan from the station, both of them stepping carefully around the massive bulk of the dead female bear. David gathered emergency equipment and critical data storage devices, ensuring that their research would not be lost, despite the traumatic end to their mission. The helicopter landing was complicated by the presence of the wounded male bear, who was still alive but no longer able to move effectively. The rescue crew included wildlife management personnel who assessed the animal's condition and made the difficult decision to end its suffering with a final shot. At 15:03 hours, all 3 researchers were aboard Rescue 1 and departing Research Station Omega-7. Below them, the facility appeared intact despite the polar bear attack, but Leonard knew that the station would need to be completely decontaminated and rebuilt before it could house researchers again. The flight to Barrow took 43 minutes, during which the rescue crew provided medical assessment for all 3 researchers. Susan had sustained minor injuries during her confrontation with the female bear. Leonard showed signs of severe stress and exhaustion, and David was suffering from the effects of prolonged cold exposure during the electrical repairs. At Barrow Hospital, all 3 researchers underwent complete medical evaluation and psychological assessment. The immediate physical effects of their ordeal were manageable, but the psychological impact of fighting for their lives against 2 of the Arctic's most dangerous predators would require extended counseling and support. Dr. Margaret Chen, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine, had treated polar bear attack victims before, but the Omega-7 incident was unusual in several respects. The coordinated behavior of the 2 bears, their systematic approach to breaching human-built barriers, and their persistence in the face of gunfire all suggested behavioral patterns that were both highly intelligent and extremely dangerous. "You're fortunate to be alive," Dr. Chen told them during their initial debriefing. "Polar bear attacks on research stations are rare, but when they occur, they're usually fatal. Your preparation and defensive planning made the difference." The initial medical reports were completed by 17:30 hours on June 30th, less than 6 hours after the attack had begun. All 3 researchers were stable and expected to make full physical recoveries, though the psychological effects would take much longer to resolve. Leonard's first call was to his wife Sarah in Anchorage, reassuring her that he was alive and safe despite the sketchy reports she'd heard on the emergency radio networks. Sarah, a nurse who had worked with trauma patients for 15 years, immediately understood the magnitude of what her husband had experienced. "Come home," was all she said, but Leonard could hear the relief and concern in her voice. Susan contacted her research supervisor at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Robert Harrison, who had been following the emergency reports throughout the afternoon. Dr. Harrison had spent his own career studying dangerous wildlife and immediately understood the research implications of the coordinated polar bear behavior they had observed. "We need to document everything," Dr. Harrison told Susan. "This kind of behavioral adaptation has serious implications for Arctic research safety protocols." David called his parents in San Diego, struggling to explain to them how a simple research assignment had turned into a life-or-death battle with polar bears. His father, a retired Marine sergeant, listened to the tactical description of the defensive actions with professional appreciation. "You did good, son. You kept your head and protected your team." The hospital's psychological evaluation team, led by Dr. James Whitmore, began immediate counseling sessions with all 3 researchers. Dr. Whitmore specialized in treating victims of wildlife attacks and understood the unique psychological challenges posed by predator encounters. "The important thing to understand," Dr. Whitmore explained during their first group session, "is that your response was entirely normal. When faced with immediate lethal threat, the human mind and body react in ways that can seem overwhelming afterward. What you're experiencing, the replaying of events, the hyper-alertness, the difficulty sleeping, these are all natural responses to extreme trauma. Leonard found himself unable to stop thinking about the moment when he had opened the station door and confronted the massive male polar bear. The image of the bear rising to its full height, its dark eyes fixed on him with predatory intelligence, played repeatedly in his mind like a loop of film he couldn't turn off. Susan was dealing with her own recurring memories of the female bear advancing through the station, the confined space making escape impossible and forcing her into a kill-or-be-killed confrontation that went against every instinct of her conservation-minded career. David's particular trauma centered on the period when he had been working on electrical repairs while his teammates faced mortal danger outside. The sense of helplessness, of being unable to assist in the defense of their position, had created a burden of guilt that he struggled to process. The evening news broadcasts picked up the story quickly, with initial reports focusing on the dramatic rescue and the unusual nature of the coordinated polar bear attack. By 2100 hours, news teams from Anchorage, Seattle, and Vancouver had arrived in Barrow seeking interviews with the survivors. Leonard, Susan, and David met with hospital administrators and National Science Foundation officials to coordinate their response to media interest. The decision was made to provide a single, factual statement about the incident while avoiding sensational details that might compromise future research operations or endanger other Arctic researchers. The official statement, released at 21:30 hours, read, "3 researchers at Arctic Research Station Omega-7 successfully defended their facility against 2 polar bears during a severe weather event on June 30th, 2025. All personnel were safely evacuated and are receiving medical care in Barrow. The incident is under investigation by wildlife management authorities and the National Science Foundation." Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, the NSF's Arctic Research Division Director, arrived in Barrow on the evening of July 1st to conduct a comprehensive review of the incident. Dr. Rodriguez had overseen Arctic research operations for 12 years and had dealt with wildlife encounters before, but the Omega-7 incident represented an escalation in polar bear aggressiveness that had serious implications for future research safety. "We need to understand exactly what happened and why," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the research team during their debriefing session. "This kind of coordinated behavior is unprecedented in our experience with polar bear encounters at research facilities." The debriefing session lasted 4 hours, with each researcher providing detailed accounts of the events leading up to the attack, the defensive actions taken during the encounter, and their observations of polar bear behavior throughout the incident. Susan's professional expertise in polar bear behavior made her observations particularly valuable. She had documented behavioral patterns that suggested the bears had been observing human activity at the station for an extended period, learning routines and identifying vulnerabilities before launching their coordinated attack. This wasn't opportunistic behavior, Susan emphasized. These animals demonstrated strategic thinking, reconnaissance, and tactical coordination. The male conducted systematic perimeter investigation, while the female positioned herself for flanking attacks. They showed no fear of humans, no deterrent response to noise or barriers, and they pressed their attack even after being wounded. David's technical analysis focused on the bear's remarkable ability to manipulate human-made barriers. The female bear had somehow learned to operate the door latch mechanism on the walkway entrance, suggesting both intelligence and manipulative capability that exceeded previous documented polar bear behavior. Leonard's tactical review emphasized the speed with which the situation had deteriorated once the bears began their final approach to the station. From the time the female bear accessed the roof until the final confrontation, less than 30 minutes had elapsed. Barely enough time for defensive preparations and far too little time for evacuation procedures. Dr. Rodriguez took extensive notes throughout the debriefing, recognizing that the incident would likely result in comprehensive changes to Arctic research safety protocols. The coordinated nature of the attack, combined with the bear's sophisticated problem-solving abilities, represented a new level of threat that existing procedures were not designed to handle. Wildlife management authorities began their investigation on the morning of July 2nd, with a team led by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist Dr. Michael Thompson. Dr. Thompson had investigated polar bear encounters throughout Alaska for 23 years and immediately recognized the unusual aspects of the Omega-7 incident. The investigation team flew to the research station by helicopter, finding the facility essentially intact despite the dramatic events of 2 days earlier. The dead female polar bear was still inside the main station, providing an opportunity for detailed examination and necropsy. Dr. Thompson's preliminary examination revealed several significant findings. The female bear was in excellent physical condition, showing no signs of starvation or disease that might have driven unusual aggressive behavior. She was approximately 12 years old, fully mature, and showed evidence of having successfully raised cubs in previous years. More significantly, the bear showed signs of having consumed human food sources in the recent past. Analysis of stomach contents revealed processed foods, packaging materials, and other indicators that the bear had learned to associate humans with food availability. This is exactly the kind of behavioral conditioning that creates dangerous situations, Dr. Thompson explained to the investigation team. Once a polar bear learns that humans are associated with food resources, it will actively seek out human contact rather than avoiding it. The male bear's carcass was found approximately 50 yards from the station, where he had died from the gunshot wounds inflicted during Leonard's defensive actions. This bear was even larger than the female, approximately 14 years old, and weighing an estimated 1,450 pounds. Like the female, he showed signs of excellent physical condition and recent consumption of human-associated food sources. Dr. Thompson's team conducted a comprehensive survey of the area around Research Station Omega-7, documenting evidence of extended polar bear presence in the vicinity. They found multiple den sites, feeding areas, and travel routes that indicated the station had been under observation by polar bears for weeks or possibly months before the attack. These animals had established this location as part of their regular territory, Dr. Thompson concluded. The research station represented both a curiosity and a potential food source, making conflict virtually inevitable. The investigation also revealed serious deficiencies in the station's defensive preparations. While the facility met all existing NSF safety standards for Arctic research operations, those standards had not anticipated the kind of sophisticated, coordinated attack that had occurred. The perimeter fence, designed primarily to keep Arctic foxes and other small animals away from the station, was completely inadequate to deter determined polar bears. The building construction, while suitable for weather protection, included multiple potential entry points that bears could exploit with their remarkable strength and problem-solving abilities. Most critically, the station's isolation meant that help was never less than several hours away, even under optimal conditions. During severe weather, the facility was completely cut off from outside assistance, leaving the research team dependent entirely on their own resources for survival. Dr. Rodriguez met with the investigation team on July 3rd to review their preliminary findings and begin developing new safety protocols for Arctic research operations. The recommendations that emerged would fundamentally change how research was conducted in polar bear territory. The new protocols would require research stations in polar bear habitat to be equipped with reinforced construction designed to resist bear entry attempts, comprehensive early warning systems with multiple backup power sources, and sufficient weaponry and ammunition for extended defensive operations. Most significantly, the minimum staffing for such stations would be increased from 3 to 6 personnel, with at least 2 team members required to have military or law enforcement training. "We can't prevent polar bear encounters," Dr. Rodriguez explained, "but we can ensure that our research teams are better prepared to survive them." The psychological impact of the Omega-7 incident extended far beyond the 3 researchers who had directly experienced it. News of the coordinated polar bear attack spread rapidly through the Arctic research community, creating anxiety and concern among scientists working in similar environments. Dr. Patricia Wells, who directed a research station on Banks Island in the Canadian Arctic, immediately implemented enhanced security measures after learning of the Omega-7 attack. "If it happened there, it can happen here," she told her research team. "We need to be prepared for the possibility that polar bear behavior is changing in ways we don't fully understand." Leonard, Susan and David remained in Barrow for 5 days following the attack, undergoing medical monitoring and psychological counseling while assisting with the official investigation. The hospital's staff was impressed by their resilience and mutual support, recognizing that their survival had depended as much on teamwork and shared decision-making as on individual courage. Dr. Whitmore's psychological evaluation revealed that all 3 researchers were experiencing symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction, but their prognosis for recovery was good. The key factors in their favor were their professional understanding of wildlife behavior, their adequate preparation for the encounter, and most importantly, their successful defense of their position. Survival guilt and hypervigilance are normal responses to this kind of trauma, Dr. Whitmore explained. What's not normal is the level of coordination and strategic thinking these bears demonstrated. That's going to make it harder for you to feel safe in similar environments in the future. Leonard found himself questioning whether he would ever be comfortable returning to Arctic research. The thought of being isolated in polar bear territory, even with improved safety measures, created anxiety that surprised him with its intensity. He had spent 20 years working in dangerous environments, but the Omega-7 incident had fundamentally changed his perception of risk. Susan's response was more complex. As a polar bear researcher, she understood that the behavior they had witnessed represented an important evolutionary adaptation that needed to be studied and documented. But the personal trauma of fighting for her life against the animals she had dedicated her career to protecting created a psychological conflict that would take time to resolve. "I know they're magnificent creatures," she told Dr. Whitmore during one of their counseling sessions. "I know they're endangered and deserving of protection, but I also know that they tried to kill us, and they came very close to succeeding." How do I reconcile those 2 realities? David's perspective was more straightforward, but equally challenging. The attack had reinforced his respect for Arctic wildlife and the dangers of working in remote environments, but it had also given him confidence in his ability to function under extreme pressure. His main concern was whether the incident would affect his eligibility for future research assignments. "I want to go back," he told Dr. Whitmore. "Not to the same station, obviously, but to Arctic research. I think what we learned from this experience will make me a better researcher, more prepared for the realities of working in these environments." The media attention surrounding the Omega-7 incident continued to intensify throughout the first week of July. National news organizations picked up the story, focusing on both the dramatic survival narrative and the implications for climate change research in the Arctic. Several news reports emphasized the connection between changing Arctic conditions and polar bear behavior, suggesting that reduced sea ice was forcing bears to seek new food sources and bringing them into increased conflict with human activity. While this analysis contained elements of truth, Leonard, Susan and David were careful to avoid oversimplifying the complex factors that had contributed to their specific encounter. Dr. Harrison arrived from the University of British Columbia on July 6th to meet with Susan and begin planning the scientific publication that would document the behavioral observations from the incident. Dr. Harrison recognized that the coordinated hunting behavior they had witnessed represented a significant finding in polar bear research. This changes our understanding of polar bears' social structure and problem-solving capability, Dr. Harrison explained. We need to document these observations in the scientific literature so that other researchers can incorporate this information into their safety planning. And the scientific paper that emerged from the Omega-7 incident would eventually be published in the Journal of Arctic Biology and would become one of the most cited polar bear behavior studies of the decade. The documentation of coordinated hunting behavior, systematic barrier manipulation, and persistence in the face of deterrence provided new insights into polar bear intelligence and adaptability. Leonard's wife Sarah arrived in Barrow on July 7th, having arranged leave from her nursing position to support her husband's recovery. Sarah had lived through Leonard's previous close calls during Arctic research, but the Omega-7 incident was qualitatively different from anything they had dealt with before. "I've always known your work was dangerous," Sarah told Leonard during their first private conversation since the attack. "But I also knew you were careful and well prepared." This time, being careful and well prepared wasn't enough. "That scares me." The conversation that followed would continue intermittently for months as Leonard and Sarah worked through the implications of the attack for their marriage and Leonard's career. The incident had demonstrated that Arctic research carried risks that could not be eliminated through training or preparation, only managed and hopefully survived. David's parents flew to Alaska from San Diego, arriving on July 8th to bring their son home for extended recovery leave. David's father, Master Sergeant, retired Carlos Ortega, was particularly interested in the tactical aspects of the defensive actions taken during the attack. "You did everything right," Sergeant Ortega told his son after reviewing the incident reports. "You maintained your position, completed your mission under fire, and supported your teammates. That's what Marines are trained to do, and you did it as a civilian under conditions that would challenge combat veterans." The validation from his father helped David process the guilt he had felt about being unable to assist more directly in the defensive fighting while he completed the electrical repairs. Understanding that his technical work had been essential to their survival helped him recognize that his contribution had been valuable, even though it hadn't involved direct confrontation with the bears. Susan's colleagues from the University of British Columbia Polar Bear Research Program held a support gathering for her in Vancouver on July 10th, recognizing both her survival and the valuable scientific observations she had made during the encounter. The research community's support was particularly meaningful to Susan, helping her begin to integrate her traumatic experience with her professional identity. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, Susan's graduate school advisor and mentor, provided perspective that helped Susan understand the broader significance of what she had experienced. "You survived an encounter that most people never face," Dr. Morrison explained. "But more than that, you maintained your scientific objectivity and documented behavior that advances our understanding of these animals. That takes remarkable professional courage." The National Science Foundation's official report on the Omega-7 incident was completed on July 15th, 2025, exactly 2 weeks after the attack. The report's findings and recommendations would reshape Arctic research protocols for years to come. Key findings included documentation of unprecedented polar bear behavioral coordination, inadequacy of existing facility defenses against determined bear attacks, and the critical importance of adequate weaponry and trained personnel for survival in extended encounters. The report also emphasized the role of climate change in altering polar bear behavior patterns and increasing the likelihood of human-bear conflicts. The recommendations included mandatory defensive upgrades for all Arctic research facilities in polar bear territory, enhanced training requirements for personnel assigned to such facilities, increased minimum staffing levels, and development of new early warning systems designed specifically to detect approaching polar bears. Leonard returned to his home in Anchorage on July 16th, beginning an extended recovery period that would include both physical rehabilitation and psychological counseling. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had offered him a position as a consultant on Arctic research safety, recognizing that his experience provided valuable insights for improving researcher protection. Susan returned to Vancouver on July 18th, where she began working with Dr. Harrison on the scientific documentation of the Omega-7 incident while continuing her recovery. The University of British Columbia provided her with full support for extended counseling and medical care, recognizing both her trauma and the scientific value of her observations. David returned to San Diego on July 20th, planning to spend several months with his family before deciding on his next career move. The National Science Foundation had indicated that his performance during the incident made him a valuable candidate for future Arctic research positions, but David wanted time to process his experience before making long-term commitments. The three researchers maintained regular contact throughout their recovery, finding that their shared experience created a bond that helped all of them process the trauma more effectively. Monthly video conferences allowed them to discuss their ongoing psychological recovery while also collaborating on the scientific documentation of their observations. Dr. Whitmore's final psychological evaluation, completed in September 2025, concluded that all three researchers had made remarkable progress in their recovery from the acute trauma of the polar bear attack. While they continued to experience some symptoms of hypervigilance and anxiety, particularly in situations that reminded them of their Arctic experience, their overall psychological functioning had returned to normal levels. The one-year anniversary of the Omega-7 incident was marked by the publication of Susan and Dr. Harrison's scientific paper documenting the coordinated polar bear behavior observed during the attack. The paper's impact on polar bear research was immediate and significant, leading to new studies of polar bear intelligence and social behavior. Leonard eventually accepted a position with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as Director of Arctic Research Safety, using his experience to improve protective measures for researchers working in polar bear territory. His work contributed to the development of new facility designs, training programs, and emergency response procedures that significantly reduced the risk of similar incidents. Susan returned to active polar bear research in the summer of 2026, working with enhanced safety protocols and equipment, but maintaining her dedication to understanding and protecting Arctic wildlife. Her experience at Omega-7 had paradoxically deepened her appreciation for polar bear intelligence and adaptability, even as it had demonstrated their potential danger to human researchers. David completed additional training in electronics and communication systems before returning to Arctic research in 2027, specializing in the advanced early warning systems that had been developed in response to the Omega-7 incident. His technical expertise and first-hand experience with polar bear encounters made him a valuable asset to research teams working in dangerous environments. Research Station Omega-7 was rebuilt and reopened in the summer of 2027, incorporating all of the enhanced safety features recommended in the NSF report. The new facility included reinforced construction designed to resist polar bear entry attempts, comprehensive early warning systems, and sufficient defensive capabilities to protect research personnel during extended encounters. The station was renamed the Leonard Marks Arctic Research Facility, in recognition of Leonard's role in defending the original facility and his subsequent contributions to Arctic research safety. The naming ceremony was attended by all 3 survivors of the original incident, marking their successful transition from victims to leaders in Arctic research safety. The polar bear population in the area around the research station continued to be monitored closely by wildlife management authorities. No incidents comparable to the Omega-7 attack have occurred at the rebuilt facility, though polar bears remain regular visitors to the area and continue to test the enhanced defensive measures periodically. The lessons learned from the Omega-7 incident have been incorporated into Arctic research training programs worldwide. The combination of behavioral documentation, survival techniques, and defensive strategies developed from the experience has prevented similar incidents at other research facilities and improved the safety of hundreds of researchers working in polar bear territory. Dr. Thompson's ongoing research into polar bear behavior has confirmed that the coordinated hunting tactics observed at Omega-7 were not unique to that incident. Similar behavior patterns have been documented at other locations throughout the Arctic, suggesting that polar bears are adapting to changing environmental conditions by developing new hunting strategies that include increased interaction with human activity. The climate change implications of the Omega-7 incident continue to be debated in scientific literature. While it is clear that changing Arctic conditions are affecting polar bear behavior and distribution patterns, the direct causal relationship between climate change and the specific coordinated hunting behavior observed at Omega-7 remains a subject of ongoing research and scientific discussion. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a climate behavior specialist at the Arctic Institute, has conducted extensive analysis of the environmental conditions leading up to the Omega-7 incident. Her research indicates that the unusually late sea ice formation in the spring of 2025, combined with reduced prey availability in traditional hunting areas, may have contributed to the bears' willingness to investigate human facilities as potential food sources. What we're seeing is not just individual bears adapting to changing conditions, Dr. Vasquez explained in her 2027 research presentation. We're documenting behavioral changes that are being passed between individual animals, possibly through observation and imitation. This suggests that polar bears are developing cultural adaptations to environmental change. The concept of cultural adaptation in polar bears was revolutionary when first proposed following the Omega-7 incident, but subsequent observations have provided supporting evidence. Research teams have documented cases of polar bears teaching coordinated hunting techniques to younger animals, suggesting that the behaviors observed at Omega-7 may become more widespread over time. Leonard's work with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has included development of a comprehensive database tracking polar bear encounters with human facilities throughout the Arctic. The database, established in 2026, has documented over 400 incidents involving polar bears and research stations, mining operations, or other human installations across Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Analysis of the database reveals concerning trends. Incidents involving coordinated behavior by multiple bears have increased from 0 documented cases prior to 2025 to 37 confirmed cases by the end of 2028. More troubling, the success rate of polar bear attempts to breach human facilities has increased from approximately 12% in incidents prior to 2025 to 41% in recent cases. We're witnessing rapid behavioral evolution, Leonard concluded in his 2028 annual report. Polar bears are learning from successful encounters and sharing that knowledge with other bears. What we experienced at Omega-7 was just the beginning of a larger adaptation process. Susan's continued research has focused on understanding the mechanisms by which polar bears acquire and transmit new behaviors. Her work with radio-collared polar bears has revealed complex social interactions that were previously unknown to researchers. We used to think of polar bears as primarily solitary animals that came together only for mating, Susan explained during a 2029 conference presentation. But our tracking data shows extensive social networks, with individuals maintaining contact across vast distances and sharing information about food sources, threats, and successful hunting techniques. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic interest. If polar bears are indeed developing cultural adaptations that include coordinated hunting of humans, the safety protocols developed after Omega-7 may need continuous updating as bear behavior continues to evolve. David's technical innovations have played a crucial role in improving early detection of polar bear approaches to human facilities. His work has included development of seismic detection arrays that can distinguish between polar bear movement and other environmental causes, infrared tracking systems that function effectively in Arctic conditions, and communication networks that ensure reliable contact with emergency response teams. The early warning systems developed by David and his colleagues have been installed at over 200 Arctic facilities since 2027, with measurable improvements in response times and defensive preparations when polar bears approach. However, David emphasizes that technology alone cannot eliminate the risks of working in polar bear territory. The bears are adapting to our technology just as they adapted to our facility designs, David noted during a 2030 interview. We've documented cases of polar bears learning to avoid detection by our sensors, approaching facilities through routes that minimize their electronic signature. It's an ongoing technological arms race. The psychological impact of the Omega-7 incident has been studied extensively by Dr. Whitmore and his colleagues, providing insights into trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth in extreme survival situations. The research has shown that all 3 survivors developed enhanced risk assessment abilities and improved performance under stress, suggesting that surviving extreme wildlife encounters may provide lasting psychological benefits, along with the obvious costs. Leonard, Susan, and David represent a unique population of individuals who have survived coordinated predator attacks and maintained their professional effectiveness, Dr. Whitmore explained in his 2029 research publication. Their psychological profiles show remarkable resilience and adaptation, providing insights that benefit other individuals working in high-risk environments. The study of polar bear attacks has become a specialized field within both wildlife management and trauma psychology, with the Omega-7 incident serving as a foundational case study. Dr. Whitmore's research protocols have been adopted by treatment centers throughout the Arctic region, improving recovery outcomes for individuals who experience wildlife encounters. The media attention surrounding the Omega-7 incident has had lasting effects on public perception of Arctic research and climate change. The dramatic narrative of human survival against coordinated polar bear attacks has become a powerful symbol for the unexpected consequences of environmental change, though researchers caution against oversimplifying the complex factors involved. Documentary filmmaker Marcus Chen produced Ice Hunters, the Omega-7 incident, in 2027, featuring extensive interviews with all 3 survivors and expert analysis of the behavioral changes observed in polar bears. The documentary won several international awards and significantly raised public awareness of both Arctic research and polar bear conservation challenges. The Omega-7 incident represents a turning point in our relationship with Arctic wildlife, Chen explained during the documentary's premiere. It shows us that the animals we're studying are studying us right back, and they're learning faster than we anticipated. The economic impact of enhanced Arctic research safety protocols has been substantial but necessary. The National Science Foundation estimates that implementing the post-Omega-7 safety requirements has increased the cost of Arctic research operations by approximately 300%, but has prevented an estimated 15 potential fatalities based on incident projections. Private industry has also invested heavily in improved safety measures for Arctic operations, with oil companies, mining operations, and shipping companies all implementing enhanced polar bear deterrence and defense systems. The total investment in polar bear safety technology since the Omega-7 incident exceeds $500 million across all sectors. Dr. Rodriguez, who oversaw the NSF's response to the Omega-7 incident, retired in 2029 but continued to consult on Arctic research safety issues. Her final report emphasized the ongoing nature of the challenges posed by evolving polar bear behavior. "We solved the immediate problem of protecting researchers from the kind of attack that occurred at Omega-7," Dr. Rodriguez concluded. "But polar bears continue to adapt, and we must continue to evolve our protective measures. This is not a problem with a permanent solution. It's an ongoing challenge that requires continuous attention and adaptation." The international implications of changing polar bear behavior have led to enhanced cooperation between Arctic nations. The Arctic Council established the Polar Bear Human Interaction Working Group in 2028, bringing together researchers, wildlife managers, and safety specialists from all Arctic nations to share information and coordinate responses to emerging threats. The working group's first comprehensive report, published in 2030, documented coordinated polar bear behavior incidents across the entire Arctic region, from Alaska to Svalbard to the Russian Arctic. The report confirmed that the behavioral changes first observed at Omega-7 had spread throughout polar bear populations across their entire range. Leonard's role in the working group has included development of standardized incident reporting protocols and training programs for Arctic personnel. His experience as both a researcher and a survivor provides unique perspective on the practical aspects of polar bear encounter survival. "We're not just dealing with individual bears learning new behaviors," Leonard explained during the working group's 2030 annual meeting. "We're documenting rapid behavioral evolution across an entire species. The bears that attacked us at Omega-7 were pioneers, but they're no longer unique." Susan's research has documented the geographic spread of coordinated polar bear behaviors through genetic analysis of hair samples collected at incident sites. Her work suggests that behavioral information is being transmitted both through direct social contact and through scent marking that allows bears to communicate across vast distances. Polar bears have developed a communication network that spans the entire Arctic, Susan reported in her 2030 research findings. Bears in Alaska are exhibiting behaviors that were first documented in Canada and vice versa. The speed of behavioral transmission is unprecedented in wildlife research. The implications of this research extend beyond polar bear management to broader questions about wildlife adaptation to human presence. The Omega-7 incident has become a case study in how intelligent predators respond to human expansion into their territory, with lessons relevant to wildlife management worldwide. David's technology development work has expanded beyond polar bear detection to include early warning systems for other dangerous wildlife encounters. His experience with the rapid behavioral adaptation of polar bears has informed development of flexible detection systems that can adapt to changing animal behavior patterns. The lesson from Omega-7 is that we can't design static defense systems against intelligent predators, David explained during a 2031 technology conference. We need adaptive systems that can learn and evolve just as the animals do. It's not enough to stay one step ahead. We need to stay one step ahead of animals that are themselves constantly learning. The 5th anniversary of the Omega-7 incident, observed on June 30th, 2030, was marked by an international symposium on Arctic research safety held in Barrow, Alaska. The symposium brought together researchers, wildlife managers, and safety specialists from around the world to assess progress in polar bear encounter prevention and response. Leonard, Susan, and David served as keynote speakers for the symposium, providing personal perspectives on survival, recovery, and the ongoing challenges of working in polar bear territory. Their presentations emphasized both the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the impressive adaptability of Arctic wildlife. 5 years ago, we fought for our lives against 2 polar bears that had learned to hunt humans cooperatively, Leonard told the symposium audience. Today, we know that what we experienced was not an isolated incident, but part of a species-wide adaptation to changing environmental conditions. Our survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in human-wildlife relationships in the Arctic. Susan's symposium presentation focused on the scientific discoveries that had emerged from the Omega-7 incident and subsequent research. The coordinated hunting behaviors first documented during their attack had led to fundamental revisions in understanding of polar bear intelligence, social structure, and adaptive capability. The bears that attacked us were not just hungry predators acting on instinct, Susan explained to the symposium. They were intelligent animals using sophisticated problem-solving techniques and coordinated tactics. Recognizing this intelligence has been crucial to developing effective protective measures and has revolutionized our understanding of polar bear behavior. David's presentation covered the technological innovations developed in response to the Omega-7 incident and their effectiveness in preventing similar attacks. The early warning systems, facility reinforcements, and communication improvements had successfully prevented fatalities in over 200 subsequent polar bear encounters at Arctic facilities. Technology alone cannot eliminate the risks of working in polar bear territory, David concluded his presentation, but the right technology, combined with proper training and realistic threat assessment, can provide the margin of safety that allows researchers to survive encounters that would have been fatal 5 years ago. The symposium's final session included a panel discussion involving all 3 Omega-7 survivors, focusing on lessons learned and future challenges. The discussion revealed the personal growth that had emerged from their traumatic experience, as well as their continued commitment to Arctic research, despite its inherent dangers. The attack at Omega-7 changed our lives, but it didn't end our careers, Susan reflected during the panel discussion. If anything, it deepened our commitment to understanding and protecting Arctic wildlife. We learned that polar bears are more intelligent and adaptable than anyone had previously realized, and that knowledge makes them more worthy of respect, not less. Leonard's final comments at the symposium emphasized the ongoing nature of the challenges posed by evolving polar bear behavior. What we experienced at Omega-7 was a wake-up call about the rapidly changing relationship between humans and Arctic wildlife. We responded to that wake-up call with improved safety measures and enhanced research protocols, but the challenge continues to evolve. The symposium concluded with the establishment of the Omega-7 Memorial Research Fund, dedicated to supporting ongoing research into polar bear behavior and human safety in the Arctic. The fund would provide grants for young researchers studying wildlife adaptation to environmental change, ensuring that the lessons learned from the incident would continue to inform future generations of Arctic scientists. As the symposium participants departed Barrow, many reflected on how much had changed in the 5 years since the Omega-7 incident. Arctic research facilities were now substantially safer. Researchers were better trained and equipped, and scientific understanding of polar bear behavior had advanced dramatically. But the fundamental challenge remained: how to conduct essential research in an environment dominated by intelligent, adaptable predators that were themselves rapidly adapting to human presence. The Omega-7 incident had demonstrated that the Arctic was not simply a harsh but predictable environment that could be managed through careful preparation and appropriate technology. Instead, it was revealed to be a dynamic ecosystem where apex predators could learn, adapt, and coordinate their responses to human activity in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about wildlife behavior. Leonard, Susan, and David had survived their encounter through a combination of preparation, teamwork, professional competence, and considerable good fortune. But their survival had come at the cost of 2 magnificent polar bears, animals whose intelligence and adaptability had ultimately led to their deaths. The moral complexity of this outcome continued to influence all 3 survivors' perspectives on their experience and their ongoing work. "We survived because we killed 2 remarkable animals," Susan observed during a private moment at the symposium. "That's a burden we'll carry for the rest of our lives, even though we had no choice. The real tragedy isn't just that we had to fight for our lives, it's that we're living in a world where such conflicts are becoming more common." The legacy of the Omega-7 incident extends far beyond the immediate improvements in Arctic research safety. It has become a symbol of the unexpected consequences of environmental change, a reminder that human expansion into wildlife territory creates challenges that cannot be solved through technology alone, and a testament to both human resilience and the remarkable adaptability of Arctic wildlife. As researchers continue to work in polar bear territory, they carry with them the lessons learned from Leonard, Susan, and David's experience. That survival depends on respecting the intelligence of their potential adversaries, maintaining constant vigilance, and being prepared for behaviors that have never been documented before. The Omega-7 incident proved that in the Arctic, the most dangerous predators are not just powerful, they're smart, and they're learning faster than anyone expected. The story of the Omega-7 incident serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, demonstrating that even in the face of unprecedented danger, human courage, intelligence, and teamwork can prevail. But it also reminds us that our relationship with the natural world is far more complex and dynamic than we often assume, and that the consequences of environmental change may emerge in ways we never anticipated. In the end, the 3 researchers who survived the coordinated polar bear attack at Research Station Omega-7 did more than simply survive. They provided the world with new understanding of Arctic wildlife, improved safety for future researchers, and a powerful reminder that in our changing world, the most important survival skill may be the ability to adapt as quickly as the remarkable creatures with whom we share this planet. The next stories. The Lake Tahoe Mauling. The crystalline waters of Lake Tahoe reflected the amber glow of sunset on April 6, 2024, as Dennis Michael Campbell guided his midnight black Tesla Model S Plaid up the winding mountain road toward his sprawling lakefront estate. The 43-year-old construction magnate loosened his Hermes tie, still buzzing from the evening's charity gala at the Ritz-Carlton, where his company, Campbell Construction Enterprises, had just pledged $2 million to local wildlife conservation efforts. The irony of what would unfold in the next 6 hours would not be lost on investigators, journalists, or the traumatized survivors who witnessed the most devastating bear attack in Lake Tahoe's recorded history. Dennis had built his fortune constructing luxury resorts across the Sierra Nevada, transforming raw wilderness into playgrounds for the ultra-wealthy. His own estate, a testament to his success, sprawled across 12 pristine acres on the lake's northwestern shore, featuring 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a wine cellar worth $3 million, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the alpine wilderness he had spent decades conquering. The main house, designed by renowned architect Miranda Chen, incorporated natural stone and timber to blend with the surrounding forest, though its 32,000 square foot footprint and imported Italian marble floors suggested anything but humble integration with nature. As Dennis pulled into his circular driveway, the motion sensors activated a symphony of LED lighting that illuminated the property's magnificent facade. The house rose 3 stories against the darkening sky, its contemporary lines softened by Douglas fir beams and river rock accents. Massive windows glowed warmly from within, where his wife Margaret was likely reading in the library, their twin daughters Sarah and Emma probably finishing homework in their upstairs bedrooms, and their housekeeper Rosa Martinez cleaning up after dinner. The Campbell family lived what appeared to be a charmed existence in this mountain paradise, protected from the wilderness beyond by manicured lawns, decorative fencing, and the assumption that their wealth could insulate them from nature's unpredictability. Margaret Elizabeth Campbell, née Morrison, had married Dennis 22 years earlier when he was still a small-town contractor with big dreams and calloused hands. Now 59, she had evolved alongside her husband's success, trading her background as a public school teacher for the role of society hostess and philanthropist. Her auburn hair, maintained weekly at an exclusive Tahoe City salon, framed a face that bore the subtle enhancements of discreet cosmetic procedures. She spent her days managing the household staff, organizing charity events, and maintaining the social connections that kept Campbell Construction Enterprises in the good graces of California's political and business elite. Margaret's greatest pride centered on their daughters, 18-year-old twins, who would graduate from their elite private academy in 3 weeks before heading to Stanford University in the fall. Sarah Michelle Campbell possessed her mother's refined features and her father's determined personality. As valedictorian of her graduating class, she had already secured internships at 2 prestigious architectural firms and planned to follow her father's footsteps into construction, though with a focus on sustainable building practices that sometimes clashed with Dennis's profit-driven approach. Her sister Emma Catherine Campbell shared Sarah's intelligence, but channeled it toward environmental studies, driven by a passion for wildlife conservation that had led to heated dinner-table debates with their father about the impact of development on local ecosystems. Both girls had inherited their father's imposing height, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with the athletic builds they had developed through years of competitive skiing and hiking in the surrounding mountains. Rosa Martinez, the family's live-in housekeeper for 12 years, had emigrated from Guatemala with her husband Carlos, who worked as a groundskeeper for several wealthy Tahoe properties. At 45, Rosa possessed an intuitive understanding of the wilderness that surrounded the Campbell estate, having grown up in the cloud forests of Central America, where jaguars and other predators demanded constant vigilance. She had often expressed concern about the family's casual attitude toward the bears, mountain lions, and coyotes that frequently wandered through the property, especially during drought years when natural food sources became scarce. Rosa's warnings, delivered in her careful English during family meals, were typically dismissed by Dennis as unnecessary worry from someone unfamiliar with modern security systems and property management. The household's other key figure, Head groundskeeper James Robert Jimmy Morrison, Margaret's younger brother, had moved to Lake Tahoe 5 years earlier, following a difficult divorce that cost him his landscaping business in Sacramento. Jimmy lived in a converted apartment above the estate's 4-car garage, maintaining the property's extensive gardens, irrigation systems, and outdoor facilities in exchange for housing and a modest salary. At 56, Jimmy possessed a deep knowledge of local wildlife gained through decades of hunting and fishing in the Sierra Nevada. He had repeatedly warned Dennis about the importance of securing garbage areas, removing fruit trees that attracted bears, and installing proper fencing around the property's perimeter. His concerns, like Rosa's, were often dismissed as rural paranoia by his successful brother-in-law. The estate's security system, installed by Titan Security Solutions and monitored by their 24-hour command center in Reno, represented the latest in residential protection technology. Motion sensors covered every approach to the house, infrared cameras recorded activity throughout the grounds, and reinforced entry points featured military-grade locks controlled by smartphone applications. The system's designer, former Navy SEAL Marcus Thompson, had assured Dennis that the setup could detect and deter any human intruder, though he had specifically noted that the sensors were calibrated to ignore small to medium wildlife to prevent false alarms from the rabbits, deer, and occasional coyotes that regularly traversed the property. As Dennis stepped out of his Tesla at exactly 9:47 p.m., the mountain air carried the sharp scent of pine and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the private dock where his 36-foot powerboat waited for weekend adventures. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for early April at the 6,200-foot elevation, and patches of snow still lingered in shadowed areas despite the warming spring weather. Dennis inhaled deeply, appreciating the crisp mountain air after spending the evening in the stifling atmosphere of the gala's grand ballroom, where California's elite had gathered to celebrate environmental conservation while consuming imported delicacies and vintage wines that cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in a month. The charity gala had been a tremendous success for Campbell Construction Enterprises, generating valuable publicity and cementing Dennis's reputation as a responsible developer who balanced profit with environmental stewardship. His keynote speech, delivered with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention, had emphasized his company's commitment to sustainable building practices and wildlife habitat preservation. The audience, composed primarily of wealthy donors and environmental activists, had responded with enthusiastic applause, particularly when Dennis announced his company's partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop construction guidelines that minimized impact on bear populations. Margaret had remained at the gala for the after-party, networking with potential clients for her interior design consultancy, while Dennis returned home to review construction plans for a luxury resort project in Mammoth Lakes. His dedication to work, even after formal events, exemplified the driven personality that had transformed him from a small-town contractor into one of Northern California's most successful developers. Dennis carried his leather briefcase up the limestone steps, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone surface as he approached the front entrance, completely unaware that he was being watched from the dense undergrowth beyond the property's landscaped perimeter. The black bear observing Dennis's arrival was a 420-pound adult male, approximately 8 years old, designated as Bear 247 in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's extensive database. This particular animal had been tagged and tracked for 3 years, following a series of incidents involving garbage raids and property damage throughout the Lake Tahoe basin. Bear 247's behavior pattern showed increasing boldness around human habitations, likely driven by a combination of drought conditions that had reduced natural food sources and positive reinforcement from successful raids on unsecured garbage containers, pet food, and bird feeders throughout the affluent neighborhoods surrounding the lake. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the regional wildlife biologist responsible for monitoring Bear 247, had recommended relocation or euthanization following the animal's most recent incident 2 weeks earlier, when it had broken into a vacation cabin near Emerald Bay and caused $12,000 in damage while searching for food. However, bureaucratic delays and budget constraints had prevented action, leaving Bear 247 free to continue its increasingly aggressive pattern of human-wildlife conflict. The bear's detailed file, stored in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Sacramento headquarters, painted a picture of an intelligent and adaptable predator that had learned to associate human habitation with easy access to high-calorie food sources. Bear 247's physical condition reflected the challenges facing the region's bear population during the ongoing drought. At 420 pounds, the animal was significantly underweight for an adult male of its age, with prominent hip bones and a sunken appearance around the flanks that indicated chronic malnutrition. The bear's thick black coat, which would normally provide insulation and camouflage, appeared patchy and dull, showing the effects of stress and inadequate nutrition. Most concerning to wildlife biologists was the bear's behavioral adaptation to human presence, displaying none of the natural wariness that typically kept wild bears at a safe distance from residential areas. The afternoon of April 6th had been particularly challenging for Bear 247, as a territorial dispute with a larger male bear had forced it away from a productive foraging area near Cave Rock State Park. The displacement, combined with the animal's growing hunger and familiarity with human food sources, had driven the bear northward along the lake shore toward the expensive residential developments that lined the northwestern beaches. These neighborhoods, with their manicured landscapes and substantial homes, typically provided rich foraging opportunities in the form of garbage containers, barbecue grills, bird feeders, and fruit trees that residents maintained despite repeated warnings from wildlife officials. The Campbell estate had appeared on Bear 247's mental map several months earlier, when the animal had successfully raided the property's recycling containers and discovered that the family frequently disposed of food waste without properly securing it in bear-resistant containers. Jimmy Morrison had repeatedly requested approval to install proper wildlife-resistant garbage storage, but Dennis had refused, considering such measures unnecessary and aesthetically incompatible with the property's carefully maintained appearance. This decision, motivated by concerns about visual aesthetics rather than practical safety considerations, had effectively created an attractant that drew Bear 247 and other wildlife toward the house on a regular basis. As Dennis entered his home through the front door, disarming the security system with a casual swipe across his smartphone screen, Bear 247 emerged from the tree line approximately 200 yards from the house. The animal's approach demonstrated the calculated intelligence that had made it so successful at exploiting human resources, moving in a zigzag pattern that utilized landscaping features and shadows to avoid the estate's exterior lighting. The bear's familiarity with the property layout suggested multiple previous visits, during which it had carefully observed the family's routines and identified the most promising entry points for future foraging attempts. Inside the house, Dennis called out greetings to his family as he removed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his bow tie. The entrance foyer, featuring a dramatic two-story ceiling and a crystal chandelier imported from Venice, showcased Margaret's impeccable taste in interior design. Polished marble floors reflected the warm light from carefully positioned fixtures, while original oil paintings by California landscape artists adorned the walls. The overall effect created an atmosphere of refined luxury that spoke to the Campbell family's success and sophisticated lifestyle, though the open floor plan and massive windows that provided stunning lake views also created multiple sightlines and access points that would soon prove tragically vulnerable. Sarah and Emma were in the family room adjacent to the kitchen, working on their final high school projects while half-watching a nature documentary about Yellowstone wildlife. The irony of their viewing choice would haunt investigators who later reviewed the evening's timeline, as the program featured extensive footage of grizzly bear behavior and attacks on humans in wilderness settings. The twins had inherited their parents' intelligence and work ethic, but their academic success had been achieved in the protected environment of elite private schools that emphasized intellectual development over practical survival skills. Their understanding of wildlife came primarily from documentaries and textbooks rather than direct experience with the predators that lived in the mountains surrounding their home. Rosa Martinez was completing her evening cleaning routine in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with china and crystal from the family's dinner while preparing ingredients for the next day's meals. Her workspace featured professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry that facilitated her efforts to maintain the household's high standards, but the kitchen's design prioritized aesthetics and entertainment value over practical security considerations. Multiple exterior access points, including French doors leading to the deck and service entrances for deliveries, created numerous potential vulnerabilities that had never been addressed by the estate's security planning. Jimmy Morrison had finished his evening maintenance tasks and was settling into his apartment above the garage with a beer and the latest issue of Field and Stream magazine. His living quarters, while modest compared to the main house, provided comfortable accommodations with a clear view of the estate's rear grounds and the forest beyond. Jimmy's military background and decades of outdoor experience had given him an intuitive awareness of his surroundings that often detected approaching wildlife before electronic systems registered their presence. However, the apartment's location and soundproofing meant that he would be unable to provide immediate assistance when the situation deteriorated. At 10:15 p.m., Bear 247 reached the estate's landscaped perimeter, where decorative fencing provided visual boundaries but presented no meaningful barrier to an animal of its size and strength. The bear's approach had been methodical and deliberate, suggesting familiarity with human security systems and confidence in its ability to overcome any obstacles. Wildlife experts would later note that Bear 247's behavior demonstrated the problem-solving intelligence that made habituated bears particularly dangerous, as they lost their natural fear of humans while retaining their physical advantages and predatory instincts. Dennis had moved to his home office, a spacious room on the second floor that featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake and custom-built shelving, displaying his collection of construction industry awards and photographs from major project completions. He settled behind his mahogany desk to review architectural drawings for the Mammoth Lakes Resort, spreading blueprints across the leather-inlaid surface while sipping 18-year-old Macallan whiskey from a crystal glass. His focus on work, admirable in most circumstances, prevented him from noticing the subtle changes in animal behavior outside that typically preceded dangerous wildlife encounters. The estate's outdoor lighting system, designed to showcase the property's architectural features and landscaping, actually worked to Bear 247's advantage by creating deep shadows and blind spots that concealed the animal's approach. Motion-activated floods would illuminate areas of detected movement, but the bear had learned to avoid these sensors or move slowly enough to prevent activation. This adaptive behavior demonstrated the sophisticated learning ability that made habituated bears so challenging for wildlife management authorities, as traditional deterrent strategies became ineffective once animals understood how to circumvent them. Margaret remained at the gala's after-party, engaging in the social networking that had become an essential component of Dennis's business success. Her conversations with potential clients and influential community members generated valuable connections for both Campbell Construction Enterprises and her own interior design practice, though her absence from the estate meant one fewer adult present to respond to the developing crisis. Margaret's cell phone, set to silent mode during the formal event, would prevent her from receiving emergency communications until it was far too late to influence the evening's tragic outcome. At 10:32 p.m., Bear 247 reached the estate's main garbage storage area, located in a utility courtyard screened from the main house by decorative landscaping. The Bear's investigation revealed several bags of household waste that contained food scraps, despite Jimmy Morrison's repeated requests for the family to use bear-resistant containers. The discovery of easily accessible food reinforced Bear 247's association between human habitation and nutritional rewards, encouraging the animal to continue its exploration of the property rather than departing after securing a quick meal. The bear's feeding behavior at the garbage area was observed by several neighbors through their security cameras, though none recognized the immediate danger or contacted authorities. Mrs. Helen Patterson, an 82-year-old widow living in the adjacent estate, noted the bear's presence in her security log, but assumed it would leave after raiding the garbage, consistent with previous wildlife encounters in the neighborhood. Her decision not to call 911 or contact the Campbell family directly reflected the community's general complacency about wildlife encounters, which were considered a minor inconvenience rather than a serious safety threat. Dr. Marcus Webb, a retired physician living 2 properties south of the Campbell estate, also observed Bear 247 through his home security system, but was more concerned about potential property damage than personal safety risks. Dr. Webb's 40 years of emergency medicine experience had never included treating victims of bear attacks, as such incidents were extremely rare in the Lake Tahoe region, despite the area's substantial bear population. His medical training focused on human pathology and trauma from accidents, violence, and disease, rather than the specific injuries caused by large predator attacks, leaving him unprepared for the devastating wounds he would soon be called upon to treat. By 10:45 p.m., Bear 247 had consumed the available garbage and began investigating other potential food sources around the Campbell estate. The bear's search pattern included the barbecue area on the main deck, where residual cooking odors provided attractive scents, and the bird feeding stations that Margaret maintained near the master bedroom windows. Each successful discovery of food traces or interesting odors encouraged the bear to continue its exploration, gradually drawing the animal closer to the main house and its human occupants. The estate's security system continued to function normally, though its sensors were calibrated to ignore wildlife movement to prevent false alarms that had previously disrupted the family's sleep and generated unnecessary emergency responses. This calibration decision, made during the system's installation 3 years earlier, reflected the general assumption that wildlife posed minimal risk to residents of secure, well-maintained properties. The system's failure to detect Bear 247's presence eliminated any opportunity for early warning that might have allowed the family to secure the house or evacuate before the situation became critical. Dennis completed his review of the Mammoth Lakes resort plans and began preparing for bed, following his typical evening routine of checking doors and windows throughout the main floor. His security check was cursory rather than thorough, focusing on ensuring that electronic locks were engaged, rather than visually inspecting exterior areas for potential threats. The routine reflected Dennis's confidence in his home's technological defenses and his assumption that the wilderness beyond his property boundaries posed no direct threat to his family's safety. Sarah and Emma concluded their homework and moved upstairs to their respective bedrooms, both planning to wake early for their final weeks of high school classes. Their bedrooms, located on the house's second floor, featured large windows that provided stunning views of Lake Tahoe, but also created multiple sightlines from exterior positions. The girls' casual attitude towards security reflected their sheltered upbringing in environments where physical safety was assumed rather than actively maintained, leaving them unprepared for the violent intrusion that would soon shatter their protected world. Rosa Martinez finished her kitchen cleaning and retired to her ground floor bedroom adjacent to the service areas, exhausted from a long day of managing household operations. Her quarters featured a single window facing the estate's rear grounds, providing a limited view of the area where Bear 247 was currently investigating the outdoor kitchen and barbecue facilities. Rosa's background growing up in predator habitat had given her an instinctive wariness of unusual sounds and movements, but the house's excellent soundproofing prevented her from detecting the bear's approach until it was far too late to provide warning or escape. At 11:18 p.m., Bear 247 discovered that the French doors leading from the main deck to the family room were not properly secured. Despite Dennis's belief that he had completed a thorough security check, the door's electronic locking mechanism had not fully engaged due to a minor alignment issue that Jimmy Morrison had noted, but had not yet been authorized to repair. This mechanical failure, insignificant under normal circumstances, created the access point that would allow Bear 247 to enter the house and transform a routine property investigation into a lethal home invasion. The bear's discovery of the unlocked doors represented a critical escalation in the evening's events, as Bear 247 transitioned from external foraging behavior to active investigation of interior spaces. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that this transition was consistent with the bear's established pattern of increasing boldness and sophistication in exploiting human resources. The animal's decision to enter the house rather than departing after securing food from exterior sources demonstrated the confidence and lack of human wariness that made Bear 247 particularly dangerous. Inside the house, the family continued their evening routines, completely unaware that their security perimeter had been breached. The open floor plan that Margaret had specified during the home's design phase created sightlines and traffic patterns that facilitated elegant entertaining, but also eliminated the compartmentalization that might have contained the bear's movement or provided escape routes for the human occupants. The architectural choices that had seemed so appealing during construction would soon prove tragically inappropriate for surviving a large predator attack. Bear 247's entry into the house was initially cautious, as even habituated bears retain some wariness when entering unfamiliar enclosed spaces. The animal's investigation of the family room proceeded methodically, with the bear using its exceptional sense of smell to identify food sources and potential threats. The room's furnishings, including leather sofas worth $30,000 and Persian rugs that had been in Margaret's family for generations, meant nothing to an animal focused entirely on survival and resource acquisition, but they would soon bear witness to unprecedented destruction. The bear's presence in the family room was first detected by the house's central air system, which began circulating the animal's distinctive musk throughout the building. This scent, detectable to humans but typically ignored in environments where wildlife encounters were considered unlikely, would later be identified by survivors as their first indication that something unusual was happening. However, the family's inexperience with wilderness situations meant that none of them recognized the significance of this early warning sign. At 11:31 p.m., Sarah Campbell became the first family member to detect Bear 247's presence when she heard unusual sounds from the main floor while brushing her teeth in her ensuite bathroom. The sounds, which she later described as heavy footsteps and objects being moved, initially seemed consistent with her father's evening security routine, or possibly Rosa preparing for the next day's activities. Sarah's assumption that the sounds had innocent explanations reflected her sheltered background and inability to recognize the audio signatures associated with large predator intrusions. Sarah's investigation of the unusual sounds led her to peer over the second-floor balcony rail into the family room, where she observed Bear 247 investigating the entertainment center and overturning furniture in its search for food sources. Her first reaction was complete shock and disbelief, as the presence of a large bear in her family's living room seemed impossible, despite the clear evidence before her eyes. The psychological impact of witnessing such an unprecedented intrusion would later require extensive therapy to address, as Sarah struggled to reconcile her understanding of home security with the reality of nature's unpredictable power. Sarah's scream of terror, piercing the house's previously peaceful atmosphere, alerted Emma and Dennis to the emergency while simultaneously provoking Bear 247 into a defensive response. The bear's reaction to Sarah's vocalization demonstrated the animal's heightened stress levels and willingness to respond aggressively to perceived threats. Wildlife experts would later note that Sarah's scream, while natural under the circumstances, represented the trigger that transformed Bear 247 from a trespassing forager into an actively dangerous predator defending its position. Emma Campbell rushed from her bedroom to investigate her sister's distress, arriving at the balcony to witness Bear 247 rearing up on its hind legs in the family room below. The bear's imposing height, reaching nearly 8 feet when fully upright, and its obvious agitation created a terrifying spectacle that exceeded anything Emma had encountered in her privileged and protected life. Her immediate instinct was to call 911, but her smartphone was charging in her bedroom, and the cordless phone extensions throughout the house were located on the main floor where Bear 247 was currently rampaging. Dennis Campbell's response to his daughter's screams was immediate and instinctive, as he rushed from his office toward the main staircase without taking time to assess the situation or develop a strategic response. His protective instincts as a father overrode any consideration of personal safety or tactical planning, leading him directly into a confrontation with a 420-pound predator that possessed significant advantages in strength, speed, and weaponry. Dennis's courage was admirable, but ultimately futile against an opponent that operated according to entirely different rules than the business adversaries he was accustomed to defeating. The confrontation between Dennis Campbell and Bear 247 began at 11:34 p.m. in the main floor foyer, where Dennis encountered the bear as it moved from the family room toward the sounds of human activity upstairs. The meeting was sudden and unexpected for both participants, as Dennis had not yet fully comprehended the nature of the emergency, while Bear 247 was focused on investigating the house's interior rather than actively seeking confrontation with humans. However, the bear's defensive posture and Dennis's position between the animal and the staircase created an unavoidable conflict that would escalate with devastating speed. Dennis's first instinct was to make himself appear larger and more threatening, raising his arms above his head and shouting in an attempt to intimidate the bear into retreating. This response, while consistent with general wildlife safety recommendations, proved ineffective against an animal that had lost its natural fear of humans through repeated successful encounters. Bear 247's reaction was to mirror Dennis's aggressive display, rearing up to its full height and producing a deep rumbling growl that reverberated through the house's marble-floored foyer. The bear's vocalization, unlike anything Dennis had previously encountered, triggered a primal fear response that overrode his rational thinking and emergency planning. The sound, described by wildlife experts as a combination of territorial warning and defensive threat, was designed by evolution to intimidate potential competitors and predators. Dennis's exposure to such primal communication broke through the psychological barriers that modern life had constructed around humanity's relationship with the natural world, forcing him to confront the reality that he was prey rather than predator in this encounter. Bear 247's attack began with a charging lunge that covered the distance between the family room and foyer in less than 2 seconds. The bear's speed, approaching 30 miles per hour despite its substantial weight, gave Dennis no opportunity to retreat or defend himself effectively. The animal's charge was accompanied by a roar that shattered windows throughout the main floor and would later be heard by neighbors nearly a quarter-mile away, providing the first external indication that a life-threatening emergency was unfolding at the Campbell estate. The physical impact of Bear 247's charge drove Dennis backward into the foyer's marble column, a decorative feature imported from Italy at a cost of $40,000. The collision between Dennis's body and the stone pillar produced injuries that would have been fatal even without the bear's subsequent attack, including multiple spinal fractures and internal bleeding from ruptured organs. However, Bear 247's assault was just beginning, as the animal's predatory instincts had been fully activated by the confrontation and Dennis's attempts at intimidation. The bear's claws, each measuring over 4 inches in length and capable of exerting pressures exceeding 2,000 pounds per square inch, inflicted devastating wounds across Dennis's torso and extremities. The animal's swipes, delivered with the full power of its massive shoulder muscles, opened wounds that penetrated through skin, muscle, and bone with surgical precision. Dennis's attempts to protect his vital organs by covering his head and chest proved futile against claws that had evolved to dig through frozen ground and tear apart large trees in search of food sources. Rosa Martinez was awakened by the sounds of the attack, including Dennis's screams and the bear's continued vocalizations, but initially assumed the noise was coming from the television in the family room. Her first instinct was to investigate whether someone had fallen asleep watching an action movie at excessive volume, a common occurrence during the twins' late-night study sessions. Rosa's movement from her bedroom toward the main living areas placed her directly in the path of Bear 247's rampage, though she remained unaware of the danger until she reached the kitchen and observed the destruction in the adjacent family room. The bear's attack on Dennis continued for approximately 3 minutes, during which time the animal inflicted wounds that would ultimately prove fatal despite the best efforts of emergency medical personnel. The assault's duration reflected Bear 247's determination to eliminate what it perceived as a territorial threat rather than simply defending its position, indicating that the bear's behavioral patterns had shifted beyond typical defensive responses into active predatory behavior. This escalation would later influence wildlife management policies throughout the Lake Tahoe region, as authorities recognized that habituated bears posed greater risks than previously understood. Sarah and Emma Campbell remained on the second-floor balcony throughout their father's attack, frozen by terror and unable to process the violence unfolding below them. Their privileged upbringing had included extensive preparation for academic and social challenges, but no training for life-threatening emergencies or exposure to graphic violence. The psychological trauma of witnessing their father's death would require years of intensive therapy and would fundamentally alter their relationship with the natural world that had once seemed so benign and manageable. Bear 247's assault on Dennis concluded when the animal determined that the human no longer represented a threat, though Dennis remained conscious and attempting to crawl toward the staircase where his daughters were calling his name. The bear's attention then shifted to investigating other areas of the house, drawn by the sounds of human activity upstairs and the rich variety of scents emanating from the kitchen and dining areas. This behavioral transition demonstrated the bear's focus on resource acquisition rather than territoriality, suggesting that Dennis's death was viewed by the animal as obstacle removal rather than predatory hunting. Rosa Martinez encountered Bear 247 as the animal moved from the foyer into the kitchen area, where she had been attempting to call 911 from the house's main telephone. The bear's appearance in the kitchen doorway, with Dennis's blood still visible on its claws and muzzle, created a tableau of horror that would haunt Rosa's nightmares for years to come. Her scream, adding to the cacophony of terror already filling the house, further agitated the bear and contributed to the escalating chaos that was rapidly consuming the Campbell family's carefully ordered existence. The bear's investigation of the kitchen proved highly rewarding from the animal's perspective, as Rosa's preparations for the next day's meals had left numerous food items accessible on counters and in inadequately secured containers. Bear 247's feeding behavior in the kitchen was methodical and thorough, with the animal consuming bread, fruit, meat, and various prepared dishes, while systematically destroying appliances and cabinetry in search of additional resources. The destruction, which would ultimately exceed $500,000 in the kitchen alone, reflected both the bear's strength and its determination to access every potential food source. Rosa's escape from the kitchen was facilitated by Bear 247's focus on feeding rather than pursuing human prey, though her route to safety required crossing the foyer where Dennis lay bleeding and semi-conscious. Her attempt to assist Dennis was prevented by his injury's severity and the continuing presence of the bear in adjacent rooms, forcing Rosa to make the agonizing decision to flee the house and seek help, rather than remaining to provide aid. This choice, while strategically sound, would generate guilt and remorse that Rosa would struggle with long after the physical wounds of the evening had healed. The bear's rampage through the main floor continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which time Bear 247 systematically investigated and destroyed furnishings, artwork, and architectural features in search of food and interesting scents. The animal's behavior demonstrated remarkable persistence and problem-solving ability, as it learned to open cabinets, drawers, and even the Sub-Zero refrigerator that contained the family's extensive collection of gourmet ingredients. Each successful discovery reinforced the bear's understanding that human habitations contained valuable resources, worth the effort required to access them. Sarah Campbell's attempts to reach emergency services were frustrated by the house's cordless phone system, which required her to venture downstairs to access the main charging station located near the kitchen where Bear 247 was currently feeding. Her cell phone, like Emma's, was charging in a bedroom electrical outlet and could not be reached without exposing herself to the bear's presence. The technological conveniences that had seemed so sophisticated during the house's construction proved inadequate for emergency communication when the family needed help most desperately. Emma Campbell's efforts to assist her sister and father were hampered by her lack of emergency training and the overwhelming nature of the crisis unfolding around them. Her attempts to create noise and distraction that might drive the bear away from Dennis proved counterproductive, as the sounds only served to further agitate an already stressed and dangerous animal. The twins' helplessness in the face of their family's destruction highlighted the gap between their elite education and the practical survival skills that might have improved their chances of managing the crisis effectively. Jimmy Morrison was alerted to the emergency by Rosa Martinez, who had successfully fled the house and reached his apartment above the garage at approximately 11:52 p.m. Rosa's description of the bear attack initially seemed so improbable that Jimmy questioned whether she had suffered some form of mental breakdown or medical emergency, as the presence of a large bear inside his brother-in-law's secure mansion violated every assumption about residential safety in affluent neighborhoods. However, the sounds of destruction emanating from the main house, audible even at their distance, confirmed Rosa's account and spurred Jimmy into immediate action. Jimmy Morrison's response to the crisis reflected his military training and decades of experience managing emergency situations in wilderness settings. His first priority was establishing communication with emergency services, which he accomplished using his personal cell phone to contact 911 at 11:54 p.m. The dispatcher who received Jimmy's call initially expressed skepticism about the reported bear attack, as such incidents were unprecedented in the Lake Tahoe region's residential areas, but the clearly audible sounds of destruction and screaming in the background convinced her to initiate immediate emergency response protocols. The 911 call transcript, later released during the investigation into the incident, captured the chaos and desperation of the evening's events. Jimmy's attempts to provide clear information about the situation were interrupted by Rosa's sobbing and continued sounds of destruction from the main house, where Bear 247 was systematically demolishing the dining room after completing its investigation of the kitchen. The dispatcher's questions about the number of victims and the bear's current location revealed the inadequacy of standard emergency protocols for addressing large predator attacks in residential settings. Emergency response coordination fell to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department, which had primary jurisdiction for the Campbell Estates location on the northwestern shore of Lake Tahoe. Sheriff Patricia Williams, awakened at her home in Placerville by the emergency dispatcher's call at 11:58 p.m., initially questioned whether the incident report represented a prank call or a confused resident's misidentification of a smaller animal. However, the growing number of 911 calls from neighboring properties reporting unusual sounds and possible gunfire convinced her to authorize immediate deployment of available resources. The first law enforcement unit to respond was Deputy Thomas Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department, who was completing routine patrol duties in South Lake Tahoe when he received the emergency dispatch at 12:03 a.m. on April 7th. Rodriguez's initial response time was delayed by the distance between his location and the Campbell estate, but his military experience in Afghanistan had exposed him to various dangerous animals and unconventional threats that proved valuable for managing the unprecedented situation he was about to encounter. Deputy Rodriguez's arrival at the Campbell estate at 12:19 a.m. coincided with Bear 247's movement from the main floor to the second level of the house, where Sarah and Emma Campbell remained trapped in the upstairs hallway. The bear's decision to investigate the upper floors represented a significant escalation in the threat to the surviving family members, as their previous safety had depended entirely on the animal's focus on ground-level food sources. The sound of the bear's heavy footsteps on the hardwood staircase created a new level of terror for the twins, who realized that their refuge was no longer secure. The bear's exploration of the second floor was methodical and destructive, as Bear 247 investigated each room in search of food sources and interesting scents. The master bedroom, with its extensive collection of Margaret's perfumes and cosmetics, proved particularly fascinating to the animal, which spent several minutes investigating the bathroom area before moving on to other rooms. The destruction in the master suite, including a 4-poster bed that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother and oil paintings worth over $200,000, represented the loss of irreplaceable family treasures alongside the more quantifiable property damage. Sarah Campbell's encounter with Bear 247 occurred at 12:24 a.m. in the second-floor hallway when the bear emerged from the master bedroom and confronted the twins, who had been attempting to reach a bathroom window that might provide an escape route to the roof. The meeting was sudden and unexpected for all participants, as the bear had been focused on investigating room contents rather than actively hunting human prey. However, Sarah's position between the bear and its intended route created another unavoidable confrontation that would result in additional casualties. Sarah's attempt to protect her sister by positioning herself between Emma and the bear demonstrated remarkable courage, but proved tactically ineffective against an animal that had already killed one family member and was operating in a highly agitated state. The bear's response to Sarah's defensive posture was immediate and overwhelming, with the animal delivering a powerful swipe that sent Sarah crashing into the hallway's decorative console, which collapsed under the impact and inflicted additional injuries from broken glass and wooden splinters. The attack on Sarah Campbell was mercifully brief compared to her father's prolonged suffering, as the bear's swipe delivered massive trauma that rendered her unconscious within seconds. The wounds, while ultimately fatal, spared Sarah the psychological torment of witnessing additional violence against her family members. Emma's screams during her sister's attack attracted the bear's attention and would have likely resulted in a third fatality if not for the timely intervention of law enforcement personnel who had finally gained access to the house. Deputy Rodriguez's entry into the Campbell estate was complicated by the bear's presence and the need to avoid provoking additional aggressive behavior while attempting to rescue surviving family members. His tactical training had included scenarios involving armed suspects and hostage situations, but no protocols existed for managing large predator attacks in residential settings. Rodriguez's improvised response strategy relied heavily on his combat experience and general principles of wildlife management rather than established procedures for bear encounters in homes. The deputy's first priority was establishing the location and status of all human occupants, which required him to navigate through the extensive destruction on the main floor while avoiding contact with Bear 247. His survey of the foyer revealed Dennis Campbell's critical condition and the immediate need for medical attention, though the bear's continued presence in the upper floors prevented any rescue attempts until the animal could be neutralized or removed. Rodriguez's radio communications with dispatch provided the first detailed assessment of the situation's severity and the resources required for effective response. Additional law enforcement units began arriving at the Campbell estate at 12:31 a.m., including Sergeant Maria Santos from the California Highway Patrol and Deputy Michael Thompson from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department across the Nevada state line. The multi-jurisdictional response reflected the severity of the incident and the limited experience that any single agency possessed in managing large predator attacks. The arriving officers established a security perimeter around the property while developing strategies for bear removal and victim evacuation. The tactical challenge posed by Bear 247's presence in the house was unprecedented in the experience of all responding officers, as standard wildlife management protocols assumed that bears would remain in outdoor environments where conventional deterrent methods could be employed effectively. The animal's position inside a structure filled with valuable property and trapped human victims required innovative approaches that balanced public safety with property preservation and wildlife conservation concerns. The decision-making process would later be scrutinized by multiple oversight agencies seeking to identify best practices for similar future incidents. Emergency medical services coordination fell to Barton Memorial Hospital in South Lake Tahoe, where Dr. Patricia Morrison was serving as the emergency department's attending physician during the night shift. Dr. Morrison's 23 years of emergency medicine experience had included treating victims of vehicle accidents, skiing injuries, and various wilderness emergencies common to the Lake Tahoe region, but she had never encountered patients suffering from large predator attacks. Her medical team's preparation for receiving multiple trauma patients began at 12:35 a.m. based on preliminary reports from the scene. The hospital's trauma response protocol was activated despite uncertainty about the exact nature and number of injuries, as preliminary reports suggested multiple casualties with severe wounds requiring immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Morrison's team included surgeon Dr. James Chen, anesthesiologist Dr. Patricia Williams, and trauma nurse Sarah Rodriguez, all of whom had extensive experience treating complex injuries, but none of whom had specialized training in managing bear attack wounds. The medical team's learning curve would prove steep as they encountered injury patterns unlike anything in their previous experience. Bear 247's eventual departure from the Campbell house occurred at 12:41 a.m., when the animal apparently decided that continued exploration was no longer productive given the increasing human activity and noise around the property. The bear's exit route through the same French doors it had used to enter the house was observed by multiple law enforcement officers who tracked its movement into the forest beyond the estate's boundaries. The animal's calm and deliberate departure suggested that it viewed the house invasion as a successful foraging expedition rather than a territorial conflict requiring continued defense. The bear's escape into the wilderness triggered immediate mobilization of California Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, including regional wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh and tracking specialist Robert Kim. Their mission included locating and monitoring Bear 247 to assess its current behavior patterns and determine whether immediate removal was necessary to prevent additional incidents. The animal's demonstrated willingness to enter human habitations and its association of such locations with valuable resources made it an extreme public safety threat requiring urgent attention. Law enforcement access to the Campbell house was achieved at 12:44 a.m., when officers determined that Bear 247 had departed, and initial medical assessment of the victims could begin safely. The scene that greeted first responders exceeded anything in their previous experience, with destruction totaling over $2 million and 3 family members requiring immediate medical attention. The house's interior resembled a war zone more than a residential property, with overturned furniture, shattered glass, destroyed artwork, and blood evidence throughout multiple rooms. Dennis Campbell was discovered in the foyer in critical condition, having lost massive amounts of blood from multiple wounds inflicted during his confrontation with Bear 247. His injuries included severe lacerations across his torso, puncture wounds from the bear's claws and teeth, multiple fractures from impact with the marble column, and internal bleeding from ruptured organs. Despite the severity of his condition, Dennis remained conscious and was able to provide basic information about the attack sequence and his daughter's locations upstairs. Emergency medical treatment for Dennis Campbell began at the scene with efforts to control bleeding and stabilize his vital signs for transport to Barton Memorial Hospital. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh and emergency medical technician Michael Santos worked to establish intravenous access and administer pain medication while preparing Dennis for the challenging transport down the mountain roads to definitive medical care. The extent of his injuries made field treatment extremely difficult, as conventional trauma protocols were inadequate for addressing the unique wound patterns created by large predator attacks. Sarah Campbell was discovered on the 2nd floor in an unconscious state, having suffered massive head trauma from impact with the hallway console during her encounter with Bear 247. Her injuries included a fractured skull, intracranial bleeding, and multiple lacerations from broken glass. Though she had been spared the deep claw wounds that characterized her father's injuries, Paramedic Robert Kim and EMT Patricia Rodriguez focused on immobilizing Sarah's spine and maintaining her airway while preparing for immediate transport to the hospital's trauma center. Emma Campbell, while physically uninjured during the bear attack, was suffering from acute psychological trauma that manifested as complete catatonia and inability to communicate with first responders. Her condition required specialized intervention from mental health crisis counselor Dr. Michael Thompson, who was called to the scene to provide immediate psychological stabilization and support during the evacuation process. Emma's traumatic response was entirely consistent with witnessing extreme violence against family members, particularly in an environment where such events seemed impossible. The medical evacuation of the Campbell family members required coordination between multiple ambulance services and air medical transport resources, as the severity of the injuries and the distance to appropriate trauma care facilities made ground transport alone inadequate for optimal patient outcomes. Dennis and Sarah were prioritized for immediate transport based on their life-threatening injuries, while Emma's psychological condition necessitated specialized mental health transport protocols to ensure her safety during the journey to medical care. Barton Memorial Hospital's emergency department received its first patient at 1:23 a.m. when Dennis Campbell arrived via ground ambulance in critical condition, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Patricia Morrison's initial assessment revealed injuries that challenged the limits of emergency medicine, with wound patterns unlike anything encountered in her extensive trauma experience. The emergency team's efforts to stabilize Dennis were complicated by continued bleeding from multiple sites and the development of shock from massive blood loss. The surgical team assembled to treat Dennis Campbell included trauma surgeon Dr. James Chen, vascular surgeon Dr. Patricia Williams, and orthopedic specialist Dr. Michael Rodriguez, representing the hospital's most experienced medical personnel for managing complex injuries. However, the unique nature of bear attack wounds required innovative approaches that combined conventional trauma surgery with techniques typically reserved for industrial accidents or military combat injuries. The surgical procedures would ultimately continue for 7 hours as the medical team worked to repair damaged organs and control bleeding. Sarah Campbell's arrival at the hospital at 1:31 a.m. triggered activation of the neurosurgical team, as her head injuries required specialized intervention beyond the capabilities of general emergency medicine. Neurosurgeon Dr. Jennifer Walsh was called in from home to evaluate Sarah's condition and determine the feasibility of surgical treatment for her intracranial bleeding. The extent of Sarah's brain injury would ultimately prove incompatible with survival, despite the medical team's heroic efforts to save her life. The hospital's blood bank resources were rapidly depleted as medical teams worked to replace massive blood loss in both Dennis and Sarah Campbell, requiring emergency requests for additional blood products from regional medical centers throughout Northern California. Type O negative blood supplies, essential for trauma patients whose blood types might be unknown, were particularly critical given the volume of transfusions required. The blood shortage would ultimately require blood bank personnel to work throughout the night coordinating emergency deliveries from Reno and Sacramento. Emma Campbell's treatment required a different approach focused on psychological stabilization rather than physical trauma care, as her catatonic state persisted despite the absence of significant physical injuries. Psychiatrist Dr. Robert Kim was called to evaluate Emma's condition and recommend appropriate treatment for acute stress reaction complicated by the traumatic loss of family members. The psychological wounds inflicted by witnessing the bear attack would prove as challenging to treat as the physical injuries sustained by her father and sister. News of the bear attack spread rapidly through the Lake Tahoe community despite the early morning hour, as emergency radio transmissions were monitored by amateur radio enthusiasts and volunteer firefighters throughout the region. The unprecedented nature of the incident generated immediate interest from local media outlets, which began deploying reporters and camera crews to the Campbell estate even before emergency response operations were completed. The media attention would ultimately complicate law enforcement efforts to secure the scene and conduct detailed investigation of the attack. Margaret Campbell received notification of her family's crisis at 2:47 a.m. through a call from Sheriff Patricia Williams, who reached her at the Ritz-Carlton, where she was staying overnight following the charity gala. The news that her husband and daughters had been attacked by a bear in their own home seemed so improbable that Margaret initially believed the call was a prank or case of mistaken identity. However, Sheriff Williams' detailed description of the scene and victims convinced Margaret that the impossible had indeed occurred, triggering her immediate departure for the hospital. The investigation of the bear attack scene began at 3:15 a.m. under the direction of Detective Maria Santos from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department, who had extensive experience investigating violent crimes but no prior exposure to large predator attacks. The crime scene processing required adapting conventional evidence collection techniques to address the unique challenges posed by animal attacks, including proper documentation of claw marks, bite patterns, and other physical evidence that might be relevant to wildlife management decisions. California Department of Fish and Wildlife personnel arrived at the Campbell estate at 3:32 a.m., led by regional wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh and tracking specialist Robert Kim. Their mission included documenting Bear 247's behavior during the house invasion, collecting biological evidence that might aid in tracking the animal, and assessing the factors that had contributed to such unprecedented aggressive behavior. The wildlife team's findings would ultimately influence bear management policies throughout California. The tracking team's initial assessment of Bear 247's route through the Campbell property revealed a systematic and methodical approach that suggested high intelligence and familiarity with human habitations. Paw prints, claw marks, and other physical evidence indicated that the bear had conducted reconnaissance of the property on multiple previous occasions, learning the layout and identifying vulnerable access points before the fatal attack. This behavioral pattern contradicted previous assumptions about bear behavior in residential areas. Evidence collection at the scene included photography of destruction patterns, measurement of claw marks and bite impressions, and sampling of biological materials that might provide DNA evidence linking specific injuries to Bear 247. The forensic documentation was unprecedented in the experience of both law enforcement and wildlife management personnel, requiring improvised protocols that combined criminal investigation techniques with wildlife biology research methods. The evidence collected would ultimately support legal proceedings against parties responsible for creating conditions that enabled the attack. Media coverage of the bear attack began appearing on local news broadcasts at 4 a.m., despite law enforcement efforts to control information release pending completion of emergency response operations. Early reports contained significant inaccuracies about the number of victims and the extent of injuries, reflecting the confusion and limited information available to reporters working under deadline pressure. The premature media attention complicated family notification processes and generated public panic about bear safety throughout the Lake Tahoe region. Dennis Campbell's surgical treatment continued through the early morning hours as medical teams worked to repair extensive internal injuries and control bleeding from multiple wound sites. The complexity of his injuries required multiple surgical specialties working simultaneously, with trauma surgeons addressing abdominal wounds while orthopedic specialists reconstructed fractured bones and vascular surgeons repaired damaged blood vessels. Despite the medical team's extensive efforts, Dennis's condition remained critical, with significant uncertainty about his prospects for survival. Sarah Campbell's neurosurgical treatment proved more challenging than initially anticipated, as imaging studies revealed extensive brain injury that exceeded the capacity for surgical repair. Neurosurgeon Dr. Jennifer Walsh's evaluation indicated that Sarah's injuries were incompatible with meaningful recovery, though life support measures were maintained pending family consultation and further medical assessment. The devastating nature of Sarah's injuries reflected the tremendous force generated by Bear 247's attack and the vulnerability of human victims to large predator violence. The search for Bear 247 began at first light on April 7th, with tracking teams deployed throughout the wilderness areas surrounding Lake Tahoe under the direction of California Department of Fish and Wildlife personnel. The search effort included trained tracking dogs, aerial reconnaissance using Department of Fish and Wildlife aircraft, and coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies to establish containment perimeters around potential bear habitat areas. The animal's capture was considered essential for public safety and for confirming its responsibility for the Campbell family attack. Bear 247's trail from the Campbell estate led into dense forest terrain that provided excellent habitat for avoiding human contact, while offering access to natural food sources that might reduce the animal's motivation for future residential raids. However, the bear's demonstrated preference for human food sources and its lack of wariness around people made it unlikely that the animal would abandon its established behavior patterns without intervention. Wildlife biologists expressed concern that Bear 247 might continue targeting residential areas unless it was removed from the population. Hospital personnel treating the Campbell family members worked throughout the morning to stabilize their patients, while providing regular updates to Margaret Campbell, who had arrived from the charity gala at 4:15 a.m. in a state of shock and disbelief. Margaret's attempts to comprehend the transformation of her family's secure and comfortable existence into a nightmare of violence and loss challenged her psychological coping mechanisms and required intervention from hospital social workers and chaplains trained in crisis counseling. The Campbell family's insurance company, Pinnacle Property and Casualty, was notified of the claim at 5:30 a.m. by the family's agent, who had been monitoring emergency radio traffic and recognized the significance of the reported bear attack. The insurance claim, ultimately totaling over $4 million for property damage, medical expenses, and wrongful death benefits, represented the largest wildlife-related claim in the company's history and would influence industry policies regarding coverage for animal attacks in residential settings. Property damage assessment began at 6 a.m. when insurance adjusters and restoration specialists gained access to the Campbell house, following completion of evidence collection by law enforcement and wildlife personnel. The destruction exceeded initial estimates, with Bear 247's rampage having caused structural damage to load-bearing walls, destroyed custom millwork throughout the house, and contaminated furnishings with blood and biological materials that rendered them unsalvageable. The restoration process would ultimately require complete reconstruction of interior spaces at a cost exceeding the home's original construction budget. Public reaction to news coverage of the bear attack included widespread panic among Lake Tahoe residents who had previously considered large predator encounters to be minimal risks in affluent residential areas. Hardware stores reported immediate sellouts of bear-resistant garbage containers. Security system installers received hundreds of emergency service requests, and many families began reconsidering their decisions to live in proximity to wilderness areas. The psychological impact of the Campbell attack extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect the entire regional community. Wildlife management authorities faced immediate pressure to implement emergency measures addressing bear-human conflicts throughout the Lake Tahoe Basin, despite limited resources and unclear legal authority for preemptive removal of animals that had not yet committed aggressive acts. The public demand for action conflicted with established wildlife conservation policies that emphasize coexistence rather than elimination of natural predators, creating political tensions that would require resolution at the state level. Dennis Campbell's condition began deteriorating at 7:45 a.m. despite ongoing surgical intervention, as complications from massive blood loss and multiple organ damage overwhelmed the medical team's efforts to stabilize his vital functions. Dr. James Chen's assessment indicated that Dennis's injuries were ultimately beyond the capacity of available medical technology, though life support measures were maintained pending family consultation about end-of-life decisions. The tragic outcome reflected the devastating effectiveness of large predator attacks against human victims. Sarah Campbell was declared brain dead at 8:30 a.m. following comprehensive neurological evaluation that confirmed the irreversible nature of her head injuries. The medical team's decision to discontinue active treatment was made in consultation with Margaret Campbell and was consistent with established protocols for managing cases where recovery was impossible. Sarah's death represented the second fatality resulting from Bear 247's attack and intensified public demands for immediate action against the animal. Emma Campbell's psychological treatment showed gradual improvement as she began responding to verbal communication and demonstrated awareness of her surroundings, though she remained unable to discuss the traumatic events she had witnessed. Her treatment plan included immediate psychiatric evaluation, trauma counseling, and long-term therapy to address the complex psychological wounds inflicted by witnessing extreme violence against her family members. The recovery process would ultimately require years of specialized treatment and would leave permanent psychological scars. The search for Bear 247 was expanded at 9 a.m., to include additional tracking teams and helicopter reconnaissance covering a broader area of potential bear habitat surrounding Lake Tahoe. The search effort was complicated by the animal's intelligence and familiarity with the terrain, which provided numerous opportunities for concealment and escape from human pursuit. Wildlife biologists warned that locating the bear might require weeks of intensive effort, even with maximum resource deployment. Media coverage of the bear attack intensified throughout the morning as national news outlets picked up the story and deployed reporters to Lake Tahoe for comprehensive coverage of the unprecedented incident. The narrative of a wealthy family attacked in their secure mansion by a wild predator captured public attention and generated extensive commentary about wilderness development, wildlife management policies, and residential security in areas adjacent to natural habitat. The media attention would ultimately influence political responses and policy changes at multiple levels of government. Margaret Campbell's first public statement was issued at 10:30 a.m. through the family's attorney, expressing grief over the loss of her husband and daughter while requesting privacy during the family's recovery process. The statement also announced the establishment of the Dennis and Sarah Campbell Foundation for Wildlife Safety, dedicated to preventing future bear-human conflicts through improved education, technology, and policy development. The Foundation's creation represented Margaret's attempt to transform personal tragedy into constructive action that might protect other families. Hospital administrators at Barton Memorial faced unprecedented challenges managing media attention, family privacy concerns, and the complex medical needs of the surviving Campbell family members. The hospital's public relations department had no previous experience with large predator attack cases and was required to develop new protocols for managing information release while respecting patient confidentiality and family wishes. The situation highlighted gaps in institutional preparation for managing high-profile medical emergencies. Wildlife tracking teams reported the first confirmed sighting of bear 247 at 11:15 a.m. in a remote area approximately 5 miles northeast of the Campbell estate, where the animal was observed feeding on natural food sources and exhibiting normal foraging behavior. The sighting provided reassurance that the bear had returned to wilderness areas rather than continuing to target residential properties, though wildlife biologists emphasized that the animal's previous behavior made it likely to resume raiding human food sources when natural alternatives became scarce. The decision to authorize lethal removal of bear 247 was made at 11:45 a.m. by California Department of Fish and Wildlife Director Patricia Morrison, following consultation with regional wildlife biologists, law enforcement officials, and legal counsel. The authorization represented a departure from standard wildlife management practices that typically emphasized relocation over elimination, but the animals demonstrated willingness to enter human habitations and inflict fatal injuries, made continued existence incompatible with public safety requirements. Specialized wildlife removal team leader Robert Thompson and his team of trained marksmen were deployed to the area where bear 247 had been sighted, equipped with tranquilizer equipment for capture attempts and high-powered rifles for lethal removal if capture proved impossible or dangerous. The team's mission required balancing public safety concerns with legal requirements for humane treatment of wildlife, creating complex tactical challenges that had no established precedent in California wildlife management history. Dennis Campbell succumbed to his injuries at 12:33 p.m. on April 7th, having survived nearly 13 hours following the bear attack, despite massive trauma that exceeded the limits of medical intervention. His death was attributed to multiple organ failure resulting from blood loss, with contributing factors including puncture wounds to vital organs, crushing injuries from impact with architectural features, and complications from extensive surgical procedures. Dr. James Chen's final assessment indicated that Dennis's injuries would have proven fatal regardless of the quality or speed of medical response. The confirmation of Dennis Campbell's death triggered immediate intensification of efforts to locate and eliminate bear 247, as public pressure for justice reached levels that exceeded normal wildlife management considerations. Political leaders throughout California issued statements demanding immediate action to prevent additional attacks, while law enforcement agencies increased patrols in residential areas adjacent to wilderness habitat. The public response reflected deep-seated fears about humanity's relationship with nature and the adequacy of technological solutions for managing natural threats. Bear 247 was located and killed at 2:17 p.m. by the Specialized Wildlife Removal Team, approximately 6 miles from the Campbell estate in a remote ravine where the animal had been feeding on a deer carcass. The bear's death was accomplished through a single rifle shot that caused immediate incapacitation without suffering, consistent with established protocols for wildlife removal operations. Post-mortem examination would later confirm the animal's identity through DNA comparison with biological evidence collected at the attack scene. The necropsy of bear 247 was conducted immediately following the animal's death by Dr. Jennifer Walsh and veterinary pathologist Dr. Michael Santos at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's regional laboratory facility. The examination revealed a malnourished animal with evidence of chronic stress and dietary deficiencies that might have contributed to its aggressive behavior toward human food sources. The bear's stomach contents included items from the Campbell household, confirming its responsibility for the attack and providing evidence for legal proceedings. News of bear 247's death was announced at 3:45 p.m. by Sheriff Patricia Williams during a press conference that attracted media representatives from throughout the western United States. The announcement provided closure for the immediate public safety threat, but generated new questions about wildlife management policies, residential development in bear habitat, and the factors that had contributed to such unprecedented aggressive behavior. The press conference marked the beginning of extensive public debate about human-wildlife coexistence in developed areas. Margaret Campbell's return to the family estate at 4:30 p.m. provided her first opportunity to witness the destruction inflicted by Bear 247 and to begin the process of salvaging personal belongings from the devastated interior. The scene of violence where her family had been attacked overwhelmed Margaret's psychological coping mechanisms and required intervention from crisis counselors and family support personnel. Her decision to never again live in the house reflected the permanent psychological impact of the traumatic events. The criminal investigation into factors contributing to the bear attack began at 5 p.m. under the direction of District Attorney Patricia Rodriguez, who was tasked with determining whether negligence or criminal conduct by any party had created conditions enabling the tragic incident. The investigation would ultimately focus on security system failures, inadequate wildlife deterrent measures, and compliance with local ordinances regarding bear attractant management in residential areas. Emma Campbell's gradual psychological recovery allowed her first coherent interview with investigators at 6:15 p.m., during which she provided detailed accounts of the evening's events that confirmed and expanded upon physical evidence collected at the scene. Her testimony, while emotionally devastating for all involved, proved essential for understanding the sequence of events and identifying factors that might prevent similar incidents in the future. The interview process required extensive psychological support to prevent additional trauma. Property restoration planning began at 7 p.m. with consultation between Margaret Campbell, insurance representatives, and restoration specialists to develop a comprehensive approach for returning the estate to habitable condition. The restoration process would ultimately require 6 months of intensive work and would incorporate enhanced security measures designed to prevent future wildlife intrusions. The cost would exceed the home's original construction budget and would establish new standards for wildlife-resistant residential construction. The Campbell family's attorney announced at 8:30 p.m. the filing of wrongful death and personal injury lawsuits against multiple parties, including the security system manufacturer, the property management company responsible for wildlife deterrent maintenance, and El Dorado County for inadequate enforcement of bear attractant ordinances. The legal action represented an attempt to assign responsibility for the tragic outcome and to compel improvements in wildlife safety measures throughout residential areas adjacent to natural habitat. Wildlife management policy review began immediately following Bear 247's death, as state and federal authorities recognized the need for comprehensive changes in approaches to managing human-wildlife conflicts in developed areas. The review process would ultimately result in new regulations requiring enhanced bear-resistant features in residential construction, mandatory wildlife safety education for residents of habitat areas, and increased funding for wildlife management programs. The policy changes represented Bear 247's ultimate legacy in protecting future families from similar tragedies. The establishment of enhanced wildlife monitoring systems throughout the Lake Tahoe region was announced at 9:45 p.m. by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, including expanded tracking of individual animals, improved early warning systems for residential areas, and increased personnel dedicated to managing human-wildlife conflicts. The monitoring improvements were designed to prevent future incidents by identifying potentially dangerous animals before they could threaten human safety, and by providing residents with better information about wildlife activity in their areas. Community meetings throughout the Lake Tahoe region were scheduled to begin the following day, providing forums for residents to express concerns about wildlife safety, to receive education about coexistence strategies, and to participate in developing community-wide approaches to managing predator risks. The meetings represented recognition that effective wildlife safety required coordinated community action rather than individual property protection measures alone. The first lawsuits filed by other Lake Tahoe residents were announced at 10:30 p.m. as homeowners sought compensation for property damage, temporary relocation costs, and psychological trauma resulting from their exposure to news coverage of the Campbell attack. The legal actions reflected widespread anxiety about wildlife risks and demonstrated the far-reaching impact of the incident beyond the immediate victims. Memorial service planning for Dennis and Sarah Campbell began that evening, with arrangements being made for services that would honor their lives while providing community healing opportunities for the many people affected by their tragic deaths. The memorial services would ultimately attract thousands of mourners and would include wildlife safety education components designed to transform grief into constructive action for preventing future tragedies. The Campbell family tragedy represented a watershed moment in human-wildlife relations in developed areas of California, generating policy changes, legal precedents, and community awareness that would influence wildlife management practices for decades to come. The deaths of Dennis and Sarah Campbell, while devastating for their family and community, ultimately contributed to improved safety measures that would protect countless other families from similar tragedies. Margaret Campbell's decision to establish the Dennis and Sarah Campbell Wildlife Safety Foundation transformed her personal loss into a lasting legacy that would fund research, education, and technology development aimed at preventing bear-human conflicts. The Foundation's work would ultimately save more lives than were lost in the original attack, creating positive outcomes from unimaginable tragedy. Emma Campbell's recovery process would require years of intensive therapy and would leave permanent psychological scars, but her survival and eventual advocacy for wildlife safety would provide hope and inspiration for other trauma survivors. Her courage in sharing her experience would contribute to public education efforts that would prevent other families from suffering similar losses. The Lake Tahoe bear attack of April 6, 2024, remains the most devastating wildlife incident in California residential history, serving as a permanent reminder of nature's power and humanity's vulnerability, despite our technological advances and assumed security. The lessons learned from the Campbell family's tragedy continue to influence wildlife management policies, residential construction standards, and community safety practices throughout the American West. The legacy of Bear 247 and the Campbell family extends far beyond the immediate tragedy, encompassing broader questions about human encroachment into wildlife habitat, the effectiveness of technological solutions for managing natural risks, and the responsibility of individuals and communities to coexist safely with the predators that share our landscape. These questions remain relevant as development continues to expand into wilderness areas and as climate change alters wildlife behavior patterns in ways that may increase conflict potential. The transformation of the Campbell estate into a wildlife education center represents the ultimate rehabilitation of the site where such devastation occurred, converting a location associated with tragedy into a resource for preventing future incidents. The center's programs serve thousands of visitors annually, teaching wildlife safety skills and promoting coexistence strategies that honor both human safety needs and wildlife conservation requirements. The comprehensive investigation of the Campbell attack revealed systemic failures in wildlife management, residential security, and community preparedness that had created the conditions for tragedy. The corrections implemented following the investigation have significantly reduced bear-human conflict incidents throughout California, demonstrating that effective prevention is possible when communities commit to implementing evidence-based safety measures. The psychological impact of the Campbell attack extended throughout the Lake Tahoe community and beyond, generating awareness of humanity's continuing relationship with wild nature despite our urbanized and technologically sophisticated society. The incident served as a reminder that wilderness exists not only in designated parks and reserves, but also in the forests, mountains, and waterways that surround our homes and communities. The memorial fund established in honor of Dennis and Sarah Campbell has grown to become one of the nation's largest wildlife safety organizations, supporting research, education, and policy development throughout North America. The fund's annual conference attracts wildlife biologists, law enforcement officials, and community leaders from around the world, sharing knowledge and strategies for preventing human-wildlife conflicts. Emma Campbell's eventual return to Lake Tahoe and her work as a wildlife safety educator represent the triumph of human resilience over trauma and the transformation of personal tragedy into public service. Her presentations to community groups, schools, and professional organizations continue to educate thousands of people about wildlife safety while honoring the memory of her father and sister. The bear-resistant construction standards developed following the Campbell attack have been adopted by communities throughout the American West, requiring enhanced security features in residential development adjacent to wildlife habitat. These standards have significantly reduced property damage from wildlife encounters, while providing greater safety for human occupants of homes in wilderness areas. The enhanced wildlife monitoring systems implemented following Bear 247's attack have successfully identified and managed dozens of potentially dangerous animals before they could threaten human safety, preventing numerous potential tragedies through early intervention and appropriate wildlife management responses. The monitoring systems represent a model for proactive wildlife safety that has been replicated throughout North America. The Campbell family tragedy ultimately contributed to a fundamental shift in how communities approach wildlife safety, moving from reactive responses to individual incidents toward proactive, community-wide strategies that address the root causes of human-wildlife conflict. This shift has resulted in significant reductions in both property damage and human casualties from wildlife encounters throughout regions that have implemented comprehensive wildlife safety programs. The investigation of security system failures at the Campbell estate led to important improvements in residential security technology, including wildlife-specific detection capabilities and integration with local emergency response systems. These technological advances have enhanced home security for thousands of families living in areas where wildlife encounters are possible. The legal precedents established through litigation following the Campbell attack have clarified the responsibilities of property owners, security companies, and government agencies for preventing wildlife-related injuries and fatalities. These precedents have encouraged more proactive approaches to wildlife safety and have provided legal frameworks for holding parties accountable for negligence that contributes to dangerous situations. The wildlife management policy reforms implemented following Bear 247's attack have strengthened the authority and resources available to wildlife agencies for managing dangerous animals, while also emphasizing prevention and education over reactive removal efforts. These policy changes have improved the effectiveness of wildlife management programs throughout California and have influenced similar reforms in other states. The Campbell family's story continues to resonate with communities throughout North America as development expands into wildlife habitat and as climate change alters animal behavior patterns in ways that may increase conflict potential. The lessons learned from their tragedy remain relevant for current and future generations, who must navigate the complex relationship between human development and wildlife conservation. The transformation of personal tragedy into constructive action, exemplified by the Campbell family's response to their losses, demonstrates the human capacity for finding meaning and purpose, even in the face of devastating loss. Their legacy serves as an inspiration for other families affected by similar tragedies, and provides a model for converting grief into positive change that benefits entire communities. The ongoing work of the Dennis and Sarah Campbell Wildlife Safety Foundation continues to save lives and prevent tragedies through research, education, and advocacy that addresses the root causes of human-wildlife conflict rather than simply responding to individual incidents after they occur. The Foundation's comprehensive approach serves as a model for wildlife safety organizations throughout North America. The ultimate significance of the Lake Tahoe bear attack lies not in the tragedy itself, but in the community response that transformed devastating loss into constructive action for preventing future incidents. The Campbell family's legacy demonstrates that even the most terrible tragedies can generate positive change when communities commit to learning from loss and implementing evidence-based solutions for protecting public safety while respecting wildlife conservation needs.